Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Jasper Tudor, the loyal uncle who became the architect of England's Tudor dynasty. This devoted guardian spent more than 3 decades fighting through the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, protecting his nephew Henry through years of exile, and ultimately helping to place the Tudor rose upon England's throne. We'll softly explore Jasper's extraordinary journey, from his birth as the secret son of a Welsh courtier and a French queen, through the bloody battlefields of medieval England, across the storm-tossed seas to 14 years of exile in Brittany, and finally to his triumphant return at the Battle of Bosworth Field, all while the great noble houses of Lancaster and York tore England apart in their struggle for the crown. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which part of Jasper's life fascinates you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 15th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Jasper, later known as Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, entered the world around the middle of November in the year 1431, in an age when autumn mists rolled across the English countryside and the first frost touched the last remaining leaves on the ancient oak trees. His birthplace was the Bishop of Ely's Manor House at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, a comfortable residence that sat among rolling fields and quiet villages, far enough from the tumult of London to provide a measure of privacy and peace. The circumstances surrounding his birth were extraordinary, wrapped in layers of secrecy, scandal, and royal intrigue that would shape not only his own destiny, but the very future of the English crown itself. For Jasper's mother was no ordinary woman. She was Catherine of Valois, the widowed Queen of England, a French princess born in the gilded halls of the Louvre Palace in Paris, who had once worn the crown matrimonial of England and had given birth to a king. And his father was Owen Tudor, a gentleman of Welsh origin, whose family claimed descent from the ancient princes of Wales, a man of striking good looks and considerable charm, but of decidedly modest rank compared to the exalted position of his royal bride. The union between Catherine and Owen was itself a tale of forbidden romance, of love defying the rigid hierarchies of medieval society, of two people reaching across the vast gulf that separated a queen from a servant in her household. To understand Jasper's story, we must first understand his mother's journey, for it was Catherine's remarkable life that made his own possible. She had been born on the 27th of October in 1391, a princess of France born into a troubled royal house. Her father was Charles VI of France, a king who suffered from periodic bouts of madness that left him unable to govern. During his episodes of insanity, Charles would believe he was made of glass and would refuse to allow anyone to touch him for fear he might shatter. The royal court of France was thus plagued by instability, with various nobles and princes competing for power during the king's incapacities. Catherine grew up in this atmosphere of uncertainty and political intrigue. She was one of many children born to Charles and his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. The French court of her childhood was torn by civil war between two great factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, who fought for control of the Mad King and the kingdom. Young Catherine witnessed violence, treachery, and the breakdown of royal authority from her earliest years. Then came the English. King Henry V of England, that most martial and charismatic of medieval monarchs, invaded France in 1415, claiming the French crown as his own through his descent from earlier English kings. At the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415, Henry's outnumbered English army won a stunning victory over French forces, killing thousands of French knights and establishing Henry as the most feared military commander in Europe. Over the next 5 years, Henry conquered much of northern France. By 1420, he was strong enough to dictate terms to the fractured French government. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on the 21st of May 1420, recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and arranged his marriage to Princess Catherine. The marriage would seal the peace and unite the two kingdoms under one crown. Catherine was married to Henry V on the 2nd of June 1420 at the Church of St. John in Troyes. She was 28 years old, he was 33. The match was primarily political, designed to legitimize Henry's claim to France, but the young queen seems to have developed genuine affection for her warrior husband. Henry, despite his reputation as a stern and pious military commander, showed kindness to his French bride. In December 1420, after a triumphant tour through England, where she was welcomed as the new queen, Catherine was crowned at Westminster Abbey in London with all the splendid ceremony appropriate to an English queen consort. The streets were decorated with banners and flowers. Pageants were performed in her honour, and the bells of every church in London rang out in celebration. For a princess who had known such turmoil in her childhood, it must have seemed that she had finally found security and happiness. The marriage produced a son, born on the 6th of December 1421 at Windsor Castle. The baby was named Henry after his father, and from the moment of his birth, he was heir to both England and France. All of Europe took notice of this princeling, who might one day unite two great kingdoms under his rule. But tragedy struck with shocking suddenness. In August 1422, while campaigning in France, King Henry V fell ill with dysentery, a common killer in medieval armies where sanitary conditions were poor. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, Henry's condition worsened. He died at the Château de Vincennes near Paris on the 31st of August, 1422. He was just 35 years old, at the height of his power and fame, and he left behind a widow barely 30 and an infant son not yet 9 months old. Catherine was devastated. In the space of just over 2 years, she had gone from being a princess in a war-torn country to the wife of England's greatest king, to the mother of the heir to 2 kingdoms, and now to a widow whose entire future was uncertain. The 9-month-old baby Henry was immediately proclaimed King Henry VI of England, but an infant could not rule. Power passed to a council of regency dominated by Henry V's brothers, John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who would control England until young Henry came of age. For Catherine, widowhood brought loneliness and restriction. As the mother of the baby king, she was honoured and respected, but she was also watched carefully. The Regency Council was deeply suspicious of any attempt she might make to remarry. They feared that if Catherine took a new husband, that man might seek to control the young king, or even claim power for himself. A law was passed in 1428 that explicitly forbade any dowager queen from remarrying without the permission of the king and his council. Since the king was a small child, this effectively meant Catherine could not remarry without the approval of the Regency Council, the same men who had every reason to prevent her from finding a new husband. The young widow queen thus found herself in a golden cage. She had wealth, status, and the love of her son, but she was lonely and isolated, forbidden from seeking the companionship and love that every human heart desires. She was still in her 20s, beautiful and vivacious, but condemned to a life of solitary widowhood unless she could find a way around the restrictions placed upon her. It was during these lonely years that Owen Tudor entered her life. His Welsh name was Owen ap Maredudd ap Tudor, and he came from a respectable but not particularly wealthy or powerful family from Anglesey in North Wales. The Tudors claimed descent from Ednyfed Ffychen, who had been Chancellor to Llywelyn the Great, the last truly powerful native Prince of Wales. This ancestry gave them a certain status among the Welsh gentry, but it carried little weight in the English court. Owen had come south from Wales and entered royal service, likely during the reign of Henry V. He served in some capacity in the royal household, perhaps as a squire, or in the department responsible for the Queen's wardrobe and household goods. He was described by contemporaries as exceptionally handsome, with dark hair, strong features, and a graceful bearing that attracted attention wherever he went. The chroniclers of the time, always eager for romantic stories, preserved several tales about how Catherine and Owen first noticed each other. One story claimed that Catherine saw Owen swimming in a river or pool and was struck by his physical beauty and the grace of his movements in the water. Another tale, perhaps more plausible given their positions in the household, suggested that Owen attended a court celebration where dancing took place. During the festivities, Owen somehow stumbled or was pushed and fell, quite literally, into the Queen's lap. The unexpected physical contact, embarrassing though it must have been, sparked a conversation, and the conversation led to further meetings. Whatever the truth of their first encounter, what developed between Catherine and Owen was genuine love. In an age where most noble marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage, where affection was hoped for but not required, Catherine and Owen fell in love simply because they wished to be together. She saw in him a handsome, kind man who treated her not as a queen to be revered from a distance, but as a woman to be loved and cherished. He saw in her not just a royal personage, but a lonely, beautiful woman who needed companionship and affection. But their love was impossible according to the laws and customs of their time. Catherine was the Queen Dowager, mother of the king, a woman whose body was almost considered state property because of the potential royal children she might bear. Owen was a Welshman of modest origins, no matter how respectable his ancestry might be among his own people. For them to marry would be to break the law that forbade the Queen's remarriage, and it would be a profound violation of social order for a queen to wed so far beneath her station. Yet love, as it so often does, found a way. Sometime around 1429, in conditions of great secrecy, Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor were married. The ceremony probably took place at Leeds Castle in Kent, a beautiful moated castle where Catherine spent considerable time and where she could control who had access to her private apartments. No official record of the marriage was made, and very few people were told of it. This secrecy would later cause enormous problems for the legitimacy of their children. But at the time, it seemed the only way Catherine could have the husband and companion she desired. For several years, Catherine and Owen managed to keep their marriage secret. They lived as husband and wife in private, while maintaining the appearance of Queen Dowager and servant in public. In this hidden marriage, they found happiness, away from the prying eyes of the Regency Council and the judgment of the court. They could simply be a man and woman in love, enjoying each other's company, building a life together as married people had done since time immemorial. Their union was blessed with children. Around 1430, Catherine gave birth to their first son, whom they named Edmund. This was a bold choice. Edmund was a thoroughly English name, born by Saxon kings of old and by various saints, a name that suggested the child's English royal heritage through his mother, even though his father was Welsh. The birth of Edmund must have brought immense joy to Catherine and Owen, though they had to be careful to keep the child's existence secret from those who might see him as a threat or a scandal. Then, around November of 1431, Catherine gave birth again. This second son was named Jasper, a name less common in England, but one that carried its own significance. The name Jasper or Gaspar had belonged to one of the three wise men or magi, who, according to Christian tradition, visited the infant Jesus bringing gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. It was thus a name associated with wisdom, royalty, and the recognition of divine kingship. Whether Catherine and Owen chose this name for its religious significance or simply because they liked it, young Jasper joined his brother Edmund in the hidden Tudor nursery. The two boys would eventually be joined by at least one more brother, another son also named Owen, who would grow up to become a monk at Westminster Abbey. There may have been daughters as well, one named Tachinda, who later married Reginald Grey, Lord Grey de Wilton, and possibly another daughter called Margaret. The exact number of children Catherine and Owen had together remains uncertain because of the secrecy that surrounded their family life. For young Jasper, the first few years of life must have been relatively peaceful and happy. He was too young to understand the complicated and dangerous circumstances of his family's situation. He had his mother's love and care, his father's protection, and his brother Edmund as a playmate and companion. They lived away from the public eye, in quiet manor houses and castles, where Catherine could maintain her privacy. The boys would have been well cared for, with servants to attend to their needs, good food, warm clothes, and comfortable beds. Catherine, despite the need for secrecy, ensured that her Tudor children were raised with the dignity appropriate to their status as the Queen's sons and the King's half-brothers, even if the world did not yet acknowledge that relationship. Owen, too, made sure his sons were treated properly. Though he came from relatively modest Welsh gentry, he understood that these boys were princes of the blood through their mother, grandsons of a king of France, and half-brothers to the King of England. They might have been born in secrecy, but they were not to be raised as commoners. The household where Jasper spent his earliest years would have followed the rhythms of medieval life. Days were marked by the prayers and services of the church. Matins in the morning, mass during the day, vespers in the evening, compline before bed. Meals were communal affairs, with the household gathering to eat bread, pottage, meat when available, and to drink ale or wine. The children would have learned their manners at table, how to behave in company, and the basic courtesies expected of well-born children. As he grew from infant to toddler to young child, Jasper would have begun to notice the world around him. He would have played in the gardens and courtyards of the manor houses where they stayed, chased butterflies in summer, watched the snow fall in winter, and listened to the sounds of the countryside. Birdsong, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the bark of dogs, and the calls of the men working in the fields. He and Edmund likely played the games that all brothers play, racing each other, wrestling, building things and knocking them down, pretending to be knights on great adventures. Perhaps their father Owen told them stories of Wales, of the great Welsh princes of old, of dragons and heroes from Celtic mythology. Perhaps their mother Catherine sang them French songs from her childhood, or told them about the grand palaces and gardens of France. But this peaceful childhood existence, hidden away from the dangers and intrigues of the world, could not last forever. The secret that Catherine and Owen had worked so hard to keep was bound to come out eventually. Royal courts were places of gossip and intrigue, where servants talked, where sharp-eyed courtiers noticed things, where political enemies searched for any information that might be useful or damaging. In 1436, when young Jasper was about 5 years old, the carefully maintained secrecy of Catherine's second marriage finally crumbled. Rumours about the Queen Dowager's secret husband and children reached the ears of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, one of the most powerful men in England, and a member of the Regency Council that governed during young King Henry's minority. The Duke of Gloucester was furious when he learned the truth. Catherine had violated the law that forbade her remarriage. More than that, she had violated social order by marrying so far beneath her station, and she had produced children of uncertain legitimacy who might claim some right to royal blood and position. Gloucester saw this as a personal affront to his authority and a potential threat to the stability of the realm. Duke Humphrey moved quickly and decisively. He ordered the immediate arrest of Owen Tudor. Royal guards were sent to apprehend Owen wherever he might be found. The charge was clear. Owen had married the Queen Dowager without permission, in violation of the law. The punishment could be severe. At minimum, Owen faced imprisonment. At worst, he might be executed as a traitor who had dared to aspire to the Queen's hand. For Catherine, the discovery of her secret and the arrest of her beloved husband was devastating. She was now pregnant with her fifth child by Owen, her body swelling with new life even as her world collapsed around her. The separation from Owen, the uncertainty of his fate, the fear for her children, and the humiliation of having her private life exposed to public scrutiny, all of this caused her tremendous emotional distress. Catherine made a difficult decision. She chose to retire from court to Bermondsey Abbey, a monastery in South London on the banks of the River Thames. Bermondsey Abbey was a place of sanctuary, where even a queen could withdraw from the world, seek spiritual comfort, and find some measure of peace and privacy. The abbey was wealthy and well-maintained, with comfortable quarters for high-status residents, beautiful gardens, and a community of monks who would pray for her well-being. In her condition, pregnant, emotionally distraught, separated from her husband who sat in prison facing an uncertain fate, Catherine must have felt that withdrawing to Bermondsey was her only option. At the abbey, she could be away from the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of the court. She could prepare for the birth of her child in relative peace, and she could pray for Owen's safety and for her family's future. On the 3rd of January, 1437, in the cold depths of winter, Catherine gave birth to her fifth child at Bermondsey Abbey. The baby was a girl, whom she named Margaret, but the birth was difficult, and Catherine, already weakened by stress and emotional trauma, fell gravely ill in its aftermath. Little Jasper, still only 5 years old, could not be with his mother during her final days. The circumstances of the family's disgrace meant that the children had been separated from Catherine, and Jasper was too young to understand fully what was happening. He could not comprehend why his mother had gone away, why his father had been taken, why everything in his small world had suddenly changed and become frightening and uncertain. But Catherine's eldest son, the young King Henry VI, who was now 15 years old, heard of his mother's illness with great concern. Despite his youth, Henry was already known for his deep piety and his kind heart. He may not have approved of his mother's secret marriage to a Welsh gentleman, but he loved her nonetheless. In a touching gesture, he sent her a precious gift, a golden tablet weighing 13 ounces, beautifully decorated with a crucifix set with pearls and sapphires. It was both a religious object to comfort her soul and a token of his filial love and concern. The gift was beautiful, and Catherine must have treasured it in her final hours. But no earthly gift could save her now. Despite the prayers of the monks, despite the ministrations of physicians, despite everything that could be done, Catherine's condition continued to worsen. The complications from childbirth, combined with her already weakened state, proved too much for even her relatively young body to overcome. On the 3rd of January, 1437, the very same day she had given birth to her daughter Margaret, Queen Catherine of Valois passed away at Bermondsey Abbey. She was only 35 years old. The Queen who had been born a French princess, who had married one of England's greatest kings, who had given birth to a king, and who had found love a second time with a Welsh gentleman, breathed her last in the quiet sanctuary of a monastery, far from the glittering courts where she had once walked in splendour. Catherine's body was taken to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried with honour in the Lady Chapel, near the shrine of her first husband, Henry V. Her son, King Henry VI, ordered that a tomb be prepared for her, though his directions that the inscription should describe her only as his father's widow, with no mention of Owen Tudor or their children, spoke volumes about the scandal that had surrounded her final years. For young Jasper, his mother's death meant the loss of the most important person in his young life. At 5 years old, children are just becoming fully aware of the world around them, forming lasting memories and developing their sense of self and family. To lose his mother at this crucial age, and to lose her in such circumstances, with his father imprisoned, his family's secret exposed, and his own future utterly uncertain, must have been traumatic beyond words. The months immediately following Catherine's death were filled with uncertainty and fear for the Tudor children. What would happen to them? Their father Owen sat in Newgate Prison, that grim fortress in the heart of London, where felons and traitors awaited trial or execution. Without their mother to protect them, without acknowledged legitimacy, and without any clear legal status, the children were in a terribly vulnerable position. Questions swirled around them like dark storm clouds. Were they legitimate or illegitimate? Could the marriage between Catherine and Owen be recognized, even though it had been conducted in secret and violated the law forbidding the Queen's remarriage? If the marriage could not be recognized, were Edmund, Jasper and their siblings bastards with no rights or claims to anything? And if the marriage could somehow be recognized, what did that make them? Were they princes of the blood, entitled to be addressed as royal kinsmen? Or were they merely the children of a disgraced match, tainted by scandal and best forgotten? The uncertainty extended to their very safety. In the violent world of 15th century politics, children of questionable status, who had some connection to royal blood, could be seen as threats. Some might argue that they should be sent to monasteries or convents, shut away from the world where they could never cause trouble. Others might whisper that more permanent solutions should be found. The ruthless politics of the age did not always spare children when powerful adults saw them as inconvenient or dangerous. But help came from an unexpected quarter. In July of 1437, just 6 months after their mother's death, Edmund and Jasper were placed in the care of Catherine de la Pole, the abbess of Barking Abbey in Essex. This was not some grim imprisonment or abandonment. Rather, it was an arrangement that would provide the boys with safety, stability, and a measure of dignity while their status was resolved. Catherine de la Pole was an important figure in her own right. She was the sister of William de la Pole, who would later become Duke of Suffolk and one of the most powerful men in England. William was a particular favourite of young King Henry VI, serving as one of his chief advisors and enjoying enormous influence at court. Through this family connection, the Abbess of Barking had the king's ear and his favour. Barking Abbey itself was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious religious houses for women in all of England. Located to the east of London in what is now the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, the abbey had been founded in the 7th century and had a long, illustrious history. By the 15th century, it housed a community of Benedictine nuns and had extensive lands and revenues that made it as wealthy as many noble estates. The abbess's residence and the guest houses at Barking Abbey were far from the austere cells that one might imagine in a convent. They were comfortable, even luxurious quarters, appropriate for the high-status residents and visitors that the abbey frequently hosted. The buildings were well maintained, with sturdy stone walls, good roofs, glass in the windows, and fireplaces to ward off the winter cold. The gardens were beautifully maintained, with flowers, herbs, fruit trees, and pleasant walks. The church was magnificent, with soaring architecture, beautiful decorations, and the daily round of liturgy and song that marked the hours. In this peaceful setting, young Jasper and his brother Edmund found stability and safety after the trauma and chaos of the previous months. The Abbess Catherine treated them with kindness and respect. She recognized that despite all the questions about their status and legitimacy, these boys were the sons of the late Queen and the half-brothers of the current king. She made sure they were properly provided for, with good food, clean clothes, comfortable lodging, and even servants to wait upon them as befitted their quasi-royal status. Life at Barking Abbey provided young Jasper with his first real education, beyond the basic care and teaching that his parents had been able to provide. The abbey maintained schools for the children of the nobility who were placed in its care, and Jasper would have attended these along with Edmund and other young people of good family. He learned to read and write, first in English and then gradually in Latin. Reading was taught using religious texts, so Jasper would have spent hours poring over psalters, books of psalms, primers, basic religious instruction books, and eventually more complex religious and philosophical works. Writing was practiced with quill pens and ink on parchment or paper, a skill that required patience and steady hands. The young Jasper also received religious instruction, learning the prayers and beliefs of the Catholic Church. He would have attended daily Mass in the Abbey's beautiful church, listening to the Latin liturgy, learning to follow the complex church calendar with its saints' days and feast days, and understanding the expectations placed upon a Christian soul. The monks and clergy who provided this instruction emphasized virtues like obedience, humility, charity, and piety, values that would shape Jasper's character throughout his life. Beyond academic and religious learning, Jasper received instruction in proper behavior and manners. He learned how to conduct himself at table, how to show appropriate respect to superiors, how to speak correctly and courteously, and how to carry himself with the dignity expected of someone of his birth. These lessons in deportment and courtesy might seem trivial, but in medieval society, knowing how to behave properly was essential for anyone who wished to be accepted in high society. The years at Barking Abbey passed in a rhythm of lessons, prayers, meals, and play. Jasper and Edmund had each other for companionship, and they may have made friends among the other children at the Abbey. They would have enjoyed the Abbey gardens in good weather, perhaps helping the nuns tend the herbs and vegetables, playing games in the open spaces, and exploring the grounds within the limits allowed them. The changing seasons would have marked the passage of time. Spring brought apple and pear blossoms to the Abbey orchards, along with the first flowers pushing up through the warming earth. Summer meant long days, warm sunshine, and the ripening of fruits and vegetables in the gardens. Autumn brought the harvest, with the Abbey's tenants bringing in their grain and produce, and the trees turning gold and red before losing their leaves. Winter meant cold, dark days spent mostly indoors, with fires crackling in the hearths and frost decorating the windows. During these years, from ages 6 to 11, Jasper's character began to form. The stability of life at Barking, after the chaos and trauma of his mother's death and the exposure of his family's secrets, gave him a foundation. The religious atmosphere of the Abbey instilled in him a sense of faith and duty. The kindness of the Abbess Catherine taught him that compassion and loyalty could exist even in a harsh world, and the lessons he learned, both academic and social, gave him the basic tools he would need for the life that lay ahead. But Jasper never forgot that he was different from the other children at Barking. He knew that his mother had been Queen of England. He knew that his father was imprisoned because he had dared to marry her. He knew that somewhere in London or one of the royal palaces, his half-brother Henry, the King of England, lived a life of ceremony and power. He knew that his own status was uncertain, that people whispered about him and Edmund, that their future depended on decisions made by others far more powerful than two young boys could ever be. This awareness of his liminal position, neither fully acknowledged as royal nor completely rejected, neither common nor fully noble, living comfortably but under the charity of others, may have taught young Jasper important lessons about humility, about the fickleness of fortune, and about the importance of loyalty to those who showed kindness. These lessons would serve him well in the tumultuous decades that lay ahead. During these years at Barking, the political situation in England remained relatively stable. Young King Henry VI was growing up, slowly taking on more responsibilities, even though the Regency Council still held most real power. The situation in France had deteriorated badly. The English were losing the territories that Henry V had conquered, gradually being pushed back until they held only Calais and a few scattered strongholds. But England itself was at peace, and the rival factions among the nobility had not yet erupted into open conflict. Jasper's father Owen remained imprisoned for a time, but he was not executed. Perhaps the fact that Catherine had died made the whole matter seem less urgent. Perhaps King Henry, as he grew older, began to take an interest in the fate of his mother's second husband. Perhaps William de la Pole, whose sister cared for the Tudor boys, put in a good word for Owen. Whatever the reason, Owen was eventually released from prison and allowed to live quietly, though he never regained his full freedom or status while the regency lasted. By 1442, when Jasper was nearly 11 years old, an important change occurred that would transform his life completely. King Henry VI was now 20 years old and beginning to assert his own will over the government of his kingdom. Henry was not like his warrior father. He had no talent or interest in military matters, no desire to lead armies or conquer territories. Instead, he was deeply pious, gentle-natured, and genuinely kind. He loved learning, art, and architecture more than warfare. He genuinely wanted to be a good king, to bring peace to his realm, and to show mercy and compassion to all his subjects. When Henry learned the full story of his mother's secret second marriage and the existence of his Tudor half-brothers living at Barking Abbey, he was moved by compassion rather than judgment or political calculation. These were his mother's children, his own flesh and blood, however scandalous the circumstances of their birth might be. They were boys who had lost their mother young, whose father had been imprisoned, who lived in uncertainty about their place in the world. Henry's kind heart could not bear to leave them in such a situation. The young king made a remarkable decision. He would acknowledge Edmund and Jasper as his brothers. He would bring them to court. He would ensure they received the education and training appropriate to royal kinsmen. He would raise them to positions of honor and grant them the titles and lands that befitted their status as the king's half-brothers. This was an act of considerable courage and generosity, for Henry knew it would be controversial. Some of his councillors would undoubtedly object, questioning the wisdom of elevating the sons of a scandalous marriage. But Henry was determined to do right by his mother's memory and by these boys who shared his blood. In March of 1442, Edmund and Jasper were brought from Barking Abbey to live at the royal court. For 11-year-old Jasper, This transition must have been both exciting and frightening. He left behind the quiet, ordered world of the abbey, with its familiar routines and peaceful atmosphere. He entered a world of noise, crowds, ceremony, politics, and danger. The world of the royal court, where fortunes rose and fell, where every word and gesture might have political significance, and where power flowed from the favor of the king. The royal court in the 1440s moved between various palaces: Westminster with its great hall and abbey, Windsor with its mighty castle overlooking the Thames, Eltham with its beautiful gardens, and others. Each palace was a world unto itself, with hundreds or even thousands of people: nobles, courtiers, servants, guards, clergymen, craftsmen, merchants, and hangers-on, all orbiting around the person of the king. For a boy raised in the relative simplicity of Barking Abbey, the royal court must have been overwhelming at first. The clothing was far richer and more elaborate than anything Jasper had seen, with nobles dressed in silks and velvets, wearing gold chains and jeweled rings, their garments carefully chosen to display their wealth and status. The ceremonies were complex and formal, with strict protocols about who could stand where, who could speak to whom, and how one should conduct oneself in the king's presence. The food at court was far more varied and elaborate than the simple but adequate meals at the abbey. Royal banquets featured dozens of dishes: roasted meats of all kinds, beef, pork, mutton, venison, swan, peacock; fish on fast days, salmon, pike, eel, lamprey; pies and tarts; elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, shaped like castles or mythological creatures; fruits and nuts; and wine from France and sweet wines from the Mediterranean. Even ordinary daily meals at court were more abundant than what Jasper had known, with multiple courses and greater variety. But King Henry ensured that his young half-brothers did not just experience the luxuries of court life. He arranged for their serious education, selecting the finest scholars and clerics to serve as their tutors. Jasper's formal education now intensified far beyond what he had learned at Barking Abbey. He studied Latin more deeply, reading classical authors like Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid, understanding not just the words, but the complex grammar and the elegant style these ancient writers had achieved. He learned rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, through exercises in composition and debate. He studied logic and philosophy, including the works of Aristotle as interpreted by medieval scholars. History became a major subject of study. Jasper learned about the classical world, Greece and Rome, understanding how these ancient civilizations had risen, flourished, and fallen. He studied the history of England from the Roman invasion, through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Norman conquest, the Plantagenet kings, and down to his own time. Understanding the past, his tutors taught him, was essential for anyone who might play a role in shaping the future. Religious education continued, but at a higher level than at Barking. Jasper studied theology and scripture, learning to understand and discuss complex religious questions. He learned the church calendar in detail, the lives of the saints, and the practices of devotion expected of a Christian nobleman. King Henry himself was exceptionally pious, spending hours each day in prayer, and he encouraged his half-brothers to take their religious duties seriously. But perhaps the most important part of Jasper's education was his training in the martial arts. Every nobleman in medieval England needed to know how to fight. Wars were common, violence was always a possibility, and a man who could not defend himself and his honor was not truly a man in the eyes of society. Jasper began training with weapons from the moment he arrived at court. He started with wooden practice swords, learning basic strikes, blocks, and footwork. The training was supervised by experienced master-at-arms, veterans of real wars who knew what worked in actual combat, and what was merely for show. As Jasper grew stronger and more skilled, he progressed to real weapons, steel swords, daggers, axes, and polearms. He learned to fight both in armor and without, understanding how the weight and protection of plate armor changed one's movements and tactics. He practiced against other young men at court, engaging in supervised bouts where the goal was to learn rather than injure. The training was hard and sometimes painful. Jasper suffered bruises from being struck with practice weapons, had the wind knocked out of him when knocked down, and experienced the aching muscles and exhaustion that came from hours of physical training. But this hard work was essential. In an age before effective firearms, skill with sword and spear could mean the difference between life and death in battle. Equally important was training in horsemanship. Jasper learned to ride not the gentle palfreys used for everyday travel, but the great war horses bred specifically for battle. These destriers or chargers were powerful, spirited animals, trained to respond to subtle commands from their riders even in the chaos of combat. Learning to control such a horse took years of practice. Jasper learned to ride at speed, to maneuver precisely, to fight from horseback with lance and sword. He practiced jousting, charging at full gallop with a lance aimed at a target or an opponent, a skill that required perfect timing, balance, and courage. He learned how to care for horses, how to recognize when a horse was tired or injured, and how to ensure his mount would be ready for battle when needed. Archery training was also essential. The English longbow was the great weapon of the age, capable of shooting arrows that could pierce armor at ranges of over 200 yards. Every able-bodied man in England was required by law to practice archery regularly. For a nobleman like Jasper, proficiency with the bow was expected. He learned to string the bow, to draw it properly using the back muscles rather than just the arms, to aim instinctively rather than using sights, and to loose arrows rapidly while maintaining accuracy. The training built tremendous strength in his arms, shoulders, and back. An English longbow required about 100 pounds of force to draw fully, and a trained archer could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Beyond individual combat skills, Jasper also studied military strategy and tactics. He learned how armies were organized, how they moved and maneuvered, how to choose advantageous ground for battle, how to use scouts and intelligence, how to conduct sieges, and how to defend fortifications. His tutors included veterans of the French wars, who could share their hard-won knowledge and experience. This education, intellectual, spiritual, and martial, continued through Jasper's teenage years. He was being shaped into the complete medieval nobleman, a man who could read Latin, discuss philosophy, conduct himself with grace at court, negotiate with ambassadors, manage estates, command soldiers in battle, and hold his own in single combat if necessary. But beyond all these skills and knowledge, Jasper was learning something even more important: loyalty. King Henry had shown remarkable kindness in acknowledging him and Edmund, in bringing them to court, in educating them, and in treating them as true brothers rather than embarrassing reminders of a scandalous episode. This kindness was freely given, with no expectation of reward or benefit. In return, Jasper developed a deep, unwavering loyalty to his half-brother the king. Henry's gentle nature, his genuine goodness, and his kindness to the Tudor brothers earned Jasper's devoted service. This loyalty would become the defining characteristic of Jasper's entire life, a commitment that would be tested repeatedly over decades of war, defeat, and exile, but which would never waver or break. As Jasper grew from boy to teenager to young man during these years at court, he also witnessed the growing problems that threatened his half-brother's kingdom. The situation in France continued to deteriorate, with English territories falling one by one to the resurgent French forces led by the remarkable peasant girl Jeanne d'Arc, and later by skilled commanders like Jean Bureau. By the early 1450s, almost all of England's French possessions had been lost, a humiliating reversal of the great conquests achieved by Henry V. At home, tensions were rising among the powerful nobility. King Henry, for all his goodness and piety, was not a strong ruler. He was easily influenced by favourites, he made poor political decisions, and he showed little talent for managing the competing ambitions of his great nobles. Factions began to form at court. Some nobles supported the king and his chosen advisors, while others, led by Richard, Duke of York, believed they could govern more effectively. These tensions simmered beneath the surface of court life during Jasper's teenage years, occasionally breaking out into open conflict before being patched over with temporary compromises. But the fundamental problems, weak royal leadership, factional competition, and the question of who should control the government, remained unresolved. Jasper watched all of this unfold with growing understanding. He saw how power worked at court, how alliances were formed and broken, how seemingly small decisions could have large consequences. He learned to read people, to understand motivations, to recognize when words did not match intentions. These lessons in practical politics would serve him well in the years to come. In 1449, on Christmas Day, Jasper received a great honor. King Henry knighted him in a formal ceremony that marked his official entry into the ranks of English nobility. The ceremony would have been held in one of the royal chapels, probably at Windsor or Westminster, before an audience of other nobles and courtiers. Jasper would have spent the night before his knighting in prayer vigil, alone in the chapel, contemplating the serious responsibilities he was about to assume. A knight was not just a warrior. He was expected to be a defender of the church, a protector of the weak, a man of honor who would uphold justice and right. The religious aspect of knighthood was taken seriously in the deeply Christian society of 15th century England. The next morning, Jasper would have been led into the presence of the king, dressed in his finest clothes. Henry would have touched a sword to each of Jasper's shoulders while speaking the traditional words, "In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I dub thee knight. Be brave, loyal, and true." After the accolade, Jasper would have been helped into armor and given his own sword, symbolizing his new status and responsibilities. The newly dubbed Sir Jasper Tudor could now bear arms officially, lead men in battle, participate in tournaments, and take his place among the knightly class. It was a proud moment for the young man who, just 17 years earlier, had lost his mother and faced such an uncertain future. Now he was a knight, acknowledged by the king, with a place of honor in English society. But King Henry was not finished showing favor to his Tudor half-brothers. 3 years later, in 1452, he took the even more remarkable step of raising both Edmund and Jasper to the peerage, granting them earldoms and all the lands, revenues, and powers that came with such high rank. On the 23rd of November, 1452, in a ceremony of great importance, Jasper Tudor was created Earl of Pembroke. This was an ancient and prestigious title. Pembroke was the 7th most senior earldom in England, and it came with extensive territories in South Wales. Most significantly, the earldom included Pembroke Castle itself, a mighty fortress built by the Normans in the 11th century and strengthened over the centuries into one of the most formidable strongholds in all of Wales. The castle at Pembroke was an impressive sight. Built on a rocky promontory overlooking the Pembroke River, it featured massive stone walls, a great round keep or donjon rising 75 feet high with walls 19 feet thick at the base, multiple towers and gatehouses, and all the defensive features of medieval military architecture. It had withstood sieges, hosted royal visitors, and served as a centre of English power in Wales for generations. With this castle and the extensive lands of the earldom came the revenues that would make Jasper a wealthy man. Landowners in medieval England derived their income from their tenants. Peasants who farmed the land paid rent in cash or kind, held by legal obligations that bound them to their lords. An earldom like Pembroke generated hundreds or even thousands of pounds per year in revenue, a fortune in medieval terms. But more than wealth, the earldom gave Jasper power. As Earl of Pembroke, he was one of the great magnates of the realm, a man whose voice carried weight in council, who could command troops from his lands, who had the right to sit in Parliament among his fellow peers. He had authority over the administration of justice in his territories, the right to appoint officials, and influence over church appointments in his region. Jasper's brother Edmund was simultaneously created Earl of Richmond, a title that came with lands in the north of England and similar powers and revenues. The two brothers were now among the highest nobility in England, raised from their uncertain childhood status to positions of great power and prestige. These promotions were extraordinary acts of royal favour. King Henry was essentially declaring that despite any questions about their parents' marriage, despite any whispers about legitimacy, Edmund and Jasper Tudor were to be treated as princes of the blood, with all the honours, respect and power such status entailed. They were his brothers, and he would acknowledge them as such before all the kingdom. Both Edmund and Jasper understood the magnitude of what Henry had done for them. In response, they swore solemn oaths of loyalty to the king. These were not empty ceremony or words spoken for show. The Tudor brothers pledged themselves absolutely to Henry, promising to support him, defend him, fight for him, and advance the interests of the House of Lancaster with all their strength and ability. For Jasper especially, this oath would become the foundation of his entire adult life. Through 35 years of war, through crushing defeats, through the execution of his father and the murder of his half-brother, through years of poverty-stricken exile in foreign lands, through periods when the Lancastrian cause seemed utterly hopeless and continuing the fight seemed madness. Through all of this and more, Jasper would never waver in his loyalty to that oath. He had pledged himself to Henry and to the House of Lancaster, and no hardship, no defeat, no inducement to switch sides would ever break that commitment. As Earl of Pembroke, Jasper Tudor now found himself transformed from a young nobleman, learning his place in the world, to a great magnate with significant power and responsibility. He was 21 years old, and the world seemed to open before him with almost limitless possibilities. The wealth, authority, and status that came with his new title meant that he could now shape events rather than simply react to them. But with this power came responsibilities that would test his abilities and eventually draw him into a conflict that would dominate the rest of his life. The lands of the Earldom of Pembroke stretched across South Wales, encompassing castles, manors, towns, villages, forests, and farmland. Jasper's territories included not only Pembroke Castle itself, but also other important fortifications and estates throughout the region. Each of these properties generated revenue through rents paid by tenants, fees from markets and fairs, profits from mills and fisheries, and various other sources that medieval lords exploited to maintain their wealth and power. Managing such extensive holdings required more than just collecting rent. Jasper needed to appoint stewards and bailiffs to oversee his estates, ensure that his tenants fulfilled their obligations, maintain the castles and buildings on his lands, resolve disputes that arose among his people, and generally ensure that his domains were well governed and prosperous. This was no small task, and it required Jasper to develop skills in administration personnel management, and practical governance that his education at court had not fully prepared him for. But Jasper proved to be a capable administrator. He chose his officers carefully, selecting men who were both competent and loyal. He made regular visits to his various properties, showing himself to his tenants and officials, hearing complaints and petitions, and making his presence felt throughout his territories. This personal involvement in the governance of his lands helped establish Jasper as a real power in Wales, not just a distant nobleman collecting rent from afar. The people of Wales had a special connection to the Tudor family that went beyond the usual feudal relationships between lord and tenant. The Tudors, through Jasper's father Owen, claimed descent from the ancient Welsh princes who had ruled before the English conquest. This Welsh ancestry gave the Tudors a certain legitimacy in Welsh eyes that purely English nobles could never achieve. Many Welsh people saw the rise of Edmund and Jasper Tudor as a vindication of Welsh dignity, a sign that Welsh blood could reach the highest levels of English nobility. Jasper was wise enough to cultivate this Welsh identity and loyalty. He learned to speak Welsh, the ancient Celtic language that was still the everyday tongue of most people in Wales despite centuries of English rule. He patronized Welsh poets and bards who celebrated his ancestry and praised his virtues in traditional Welsh verse. He showed respect for Welsh customs and traditions, understanding that the Welsh people valued their distinct culture and resented attempts to make them into mere copies of the English. This cultivation of Welsh support would prove crucial in the years to come. When civil war eventually erupted and Jasper needed to raise armies, the loyalty of the Welsh people to the Tudor family would provide him with soldiers willing to fight and die for the Lancastrian cause. The bond between Jasper and Wales was not just political calculation. It seems to have been genuine. Jasper appears to have felt a real connection to his Welsh heritage and to have valued the loyalty of the Welsh people who supported him through decades of struggle. Between 1456 and 1459, Jasper worked diligently to expand and consolidate his power in West Wales. In 1456, he took control of Carmarthen Castle and Aberystwyth Castle, two important fortresses that extended his military and political reach across a wider area of Wales. These castles were not just military installations, they were centres of government and administration, symbols of authority that announced to everyone in the region that Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, was the dominant power in that part of Wales. Taking control of these castles required more than just showing up and claiming them. Medieval castles were usually garrisoned by soldiers loyal to whoever had appointed them, and the constables who commanded the garrisons often had their own sources of authority and support. Jasper had to negotiate, persuade, and occasionally threaten to ensure that control of these strategic positions passed into his hands. The fact that he succeeded in taking Carmarthen and Aberystwyth speaks to his growing political skill and the authority that came from being the king's half-brother and a recognized earl of the realm. During these years of the mid-1450s, Jasper also developed close relationships with his sister-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, and with his infant nephew, Henry Tudor. These relationships would prove to be among the most important of Jasper's entire life, shaping not only his own destiny, but the future of England itself. Jasper's brother Edmund had married Margaret Beaufort in November of 1455. Margaret was barely 12 years old at the time of her marriage, shockingly young even by the standards of an age when girls were often married early. She was an heiress of considerable importance, for through her mother she descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, one of the sons of King Edward III. This Beaufort blood gave Margaret, and any children she might bear, a claim to Lancastrian royal lineage that made her exceptionally valuable in the dynastic politics of the time. Edmund Tudor's marriage to Margaret was thus both personally advantageous and politically significant. It brought wealth into the Tudor family and connected them even more closely to the Lancastrian royal line. But the marriage would prove tragically brief. In the summer of 1456, Edmund was captured by Yorkist forces led by William Herbert during the increasingly bitter conflicts between the Lancastrian government and the Duke of York's supporters. Edmund was imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, where he contracted an illness, probably plague or typhus, diseases that spread easily in the close, unsanitary conditions of medieval prisons. By November of 1456, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the elder of the Tudor brothers, was dead at approximately 26 years of age. He never saw his son, for Margaret was already pregnant at the time of his death, perhaps 3 or 4 months along. Jasper was devastated by his brother's death. Edmund had been his companion since childhood, his fellow student at court, his partner in receiving the great honours that King Henry had bestowed upon them. They had been raised together, knighted together, elevated to the peerage together. Now Edmund was gone, struck down by disease, while a prisoner of the family's enemies, dying before he could see his child or enjoy the high position he had achieved. But grief could not be allowed to paralyze action. Margaret Beaufort was alone, widowed at 13 years old, pregnant with a child whose father would never know him, and vulnerable in a kingdom sliding toward civil war. Jasper immediately stepped in to provide protection and support for his brother's widow. This was not just family duty, it was political necessity. Margaret's unborn child would be a Tudor, carrying both the Tudor name and the precious Beaufort blood that connected the baby to the Lancastrian royal line. Jasper brought Margaret to Pembroke Castle, his great fortress in South Wales, where she could be safe under his protection. The castle's massive walls, strong garrison, and remote location in Wales made it one of the safest places in the kingdom for someone who might be targeted by the family's enemies. There, in the protection of Pembroke's stone walls, Margaret would spend the final months of her pregnancy. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was bitterly cold, and young Margaret, still just 13 years old and small of stature even for that age, faced her pregnancy with both hope and fear. Childbirth was always dangerous in medieval times. Before modern medicine and sanitation, many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. For a girl as young and small as Margaret, the risks were even greater. Her body was not fully developed, not really ready to carry and deliver a child, and everyone around her must have worried about whether she would survive. Jasper ensured that Margaret had the best care available. He brought in experienced midwives who knew how to assist in difficult births. He made sure she was well fed and comfortable, that her chambers were warm despite the winter cold, that she had women to attend her and keep her company during the long months of waiting. He visited her regularly, reassuring her of his protection and support, promising that her child would be cared for no matter what happened. On the 28th of January, 1457, in the great fortress of Pembroke Castle, with the winter wind howling outside and the sea crashing against the rocks below, Margaret Beaufort gave birth to a son. The labour was long and difficult, as everyone had feared. Margaret's young body struggled with the demands of childbirth, and there must have been times when both she and her attendants wondered if she would survive. But Margaret was stronger than she looked. She endured the pain and danger, and finally her son was born, a healthy baby boy who cried lustily as he entered the world. The baby was washed, swaddled in cloth, and presented to his exhausted but relieved mother. She named him Henry, after her royal kinsman, King Henry VI, a name that honoured the Lancastrian royal house to which the child belonged through his mother's Beaufort blood. For Jasper, the birth of this nephew was a moment of profound joy mixed with solemnity. This baby was his brother Edmund's son, carrying on the Tudor line. More than that, the child was a potential claimant to the throne through his mother's Beaufort descent. In an age when infant mortality was high and many children did not survive their first years, no one could predict what role this baby Henry Tudor might play. But Jasper understood that the child was important, that he might need protection and guidance, and that the oath of loyalty Jasper had sworn to King Henry and the House of Lancaster now extended to this infant as well. The birth, however, left Margaret severely traumatized. The difficult labour seems to have caused internal damage that would prevent her from ever having another child, despite 2 subsequent marriages. At 13, Margaret had become a mother, but the experience had taken a permanent toll on her body. She would recover from the immediate effects of childbirth, but she would never forget the pain and trauma of that January night at Pembroke Castle. For little Henry Tudor, Pembroke Castle was his birthplace and his home for the first few years of life. The mighty fortress, with its round keep and strong walls, was the first thing his infant eyes would have seen when he was carried outside his mother's chambers. The sound of the sea, the cries of seabirds, the Welsh voices of the garrison soldiers, the smell of salt air. These were the first impressions that would have formed in the baby's developing mind. Jasper took his role as uncle seriously. Though he could not raise Henry himself, the boy remained with his mother, Margaret. As was proper, Jasper made sure that his nephew was well provided for. He visited them often, brought gifts for the child, and ensured that Margaret had everything she needed to care for her son properly. He began to think of himself not just as Henry's uncle, but as a protector and guardian, someone who would watch over the boy and help guide him as he grew. But Jasper could not spend all his time at Pembroke Castle. He had duties throughout his earldom and responsibilities in the wider kingdom that required his attention. The political situation in England was deteriorating rapidly, and Jasper found himself increasingly drawn into the conflicts that would eventually explode into full-scale civil war. The roots of the Wars of the Roses lay in the disastrous end of the 100 Years' War with France and in the weak leadership of King Henry VI. By the early 1450s, England had lost almost all of its territories in France, a humiliating reversal of the great conquests achieved by Henry V just a generation earlier. The loss of these French lands meant not only a blow to English pride, but also the return of thousands of soldiers and nobles who had made their fortunes and careers in France. These men, now without employment or income from their French estates, were angry, frustrated, and looking for someone to blame. The blame fell primarily on King Henry's chief advisors, particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. These men were accused of mismanaging the war, of making bad decisions that led to defeat, and of enriching themselves while England lost its French Empire. The criticism had some validity. Both Somerset and Suffolk had indeed made serious military and diplomatic mistakes, but the situation was more complex than the angry critics acknowledged. Leading the opposition to Henry's government was Richard, Duke of York, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in England. York had his own claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III, and many people believed his claim was actually stronger than King Henry's. York and his supporters argued that England needed better governance, that the king's favourites were corrupt and incompetent, and that reforms were necessary to restore English power and prestige. The tensions between the court party, supporting King Henry and his advisors, and the Yorkist party, supporting the Duke of York and his demands for reform, grew increasingly bitter through the late 1440s and early 1450s. Both sides built up armed followings, and minor incidents of violence became more common. The kingdom was sliding towards civil war, though few people yet understood how catastrophic that war would be. In 1453, a crisis pushed England to the brink of disaster. King Henry VI suffered some kind of mental breakdown or illness that left him completely unresponsive and unable to govern. For over a year, from August 1453 to Christmas 1454, Henry was essentially catatonic, unable to speak, unable to recognize people, unable to perform any of the duties of kingship. Modern historians have debated what caused this breakdown. It may have been a form of schizophrenia, severe depression, or perhaps he had inherited his grandfather Charles VI's tendency toward mental illness. With the king incapacitated, England needed someone to govern in his place. After much debate and political maneuvering, the Duke of York was appointed Lord Protector, essentially ruling England as regent during Henry's illness. York used this opportunity to remove his enemies from power, dismissing Somerset and other court favourites and replacing them with his own supporters. But then, miraculously, Henry recovered. By Christmas of 1454, the king's mental fog had lifted, and he returned to something approaching normal functioning. He had no memory of the previous year, and was shocked to learn that he now had a son. Queen Margaret had given birth to Prince Edward of Lancaster in October 1453, but Henry's illness meant he had not been aware of his child's birth at the time. With Henry's recovery, the political situation immediately reversed. Queen Margaret, who had watched helplessly as York dismissed her allies and took power during her husband's illness, was determined to regain control. She convinced Henry to dismiss York and restore Somerset and the other court favourites to their positions. York and his supporters, who had enjoyed power during the king's illness, were now out of favour again. This rapid reversal created enormous resentment and fear among the Yorkists. They had seen what happened when they were out of power. They were dismissed from office, their influence evaporated, and some feared they might be arrested or worse. They decided that they could not allow themselves to be pushed aside so easily. If the king would not govern properly, and if the queen and her favourites would not allow reform, then perhaps force was necessary. In May of 1455, the tensions finally erupted into violence. The Duke of York, along with his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who would later become known as the Kingmaker, gathered an armed force and marched toward London. King Henry, with Queen Margaret and Prince Edward, gathered their own forces and moved to intercept the Yorkists. The two armies met at St Albans, a town about 20 miles north of London, on the 22nd of May, 1455. The First Battle of St Albans was relatively small as medieval battles went. Each side had only a few thousand men, but it was shocking nonetheless. This was not a rebellion by foreign enemies or peasant rebels. This was English nobles fighting other English nobles, subjects taking up arms against their king, the kingdom tearing itself apart. Jasper Tudor fought in this battle on the Lancastrian side, supporting his half-brother King Henry against the Yorkist challengers. At 24 years old, this was Jasper's first experience of real combat, and it must have been a terrifying and sobering experience. The careful training he had received at court, the practice fights with wooden and blunted weapons, the tournament combats conducted according to rules, none of this could truly prepare a man for the chaos and horror of actual battle. The fighting at St Albans took place in the narrow streets of the town, making it confused and brutal. The Earl of Warwick's men broke through the Lancastrian defences and poured into the town centre. attacking the king's forces from multiple directions. In the melee that followed, several important Lancastrian nobles were killed, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, whose death would have long-lasting consequences. King Henry himself was slightly wounded by an arrow and was captured by the Yorkist forces. For Jasper, seeing his beloved half-brother taken prisoner by rebels must have been infuriating and frightening, but he survived the battle without being captured or killed, and he managed to escape from St. Albans as the Lancastrian forces broke and fled. In the aftermath of the battle, the Duke of York and his allies took control of the government once again. With the captive king essentially their puppet, they moved quickly to legitimize their position, forcing Henry to appear before Parliament and to ratify their actions. But they also claimed, perhaps sincerely, that they bore no ill will toward the king himself. They had only fought against his evil counsellors, and now that those counsellors were dead or removed from power, peace could be restored. For a time, this fiction seemed to hold. An uneasy peace settled over England as both sides tried to find a way forward, without further bloodshed. Jasper and other loyal Lancastrians worked to negotiate reconciliation, trying to find a settlement that would satisfy Yorkist demands for reform, while also protecting the king's authority and the interests of the Lancastrian party. In 1456, a great ceremony of reconciliation was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The rival nobles walked together in procession, making public shows of friendship and mutual respect. The Duke of York walked hand in hand with Queen Margaret. The Earl of Warwick walked with the Duke of Exeter. The ceremony was meant to demonstrate that the conflict was over, that the nobility of England had put aside their differences, and that peace had been restored. But beneath the surface, little had actually been resolved. The fundamental problems remained: weak royal leadership, competing noble factions, disputes over who should advise the king and control the government. The peace of 1456 was built on show and pretense rather than genuine reconciliation, and both sides knew it could not last. Jasper spent the years from 1456 to 1459 managing his estates, building up his military resources, and maintaining his connections with other Lancastrian supporters. He understood that war was likely to come again, and when it did, he wanted to be ready. He trained his men, stockpiled weapons and supplies, and ensured that his castles were well maintained and properly garrisoned. He also maintained close contact with Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had emerged as the real leader of the Lancastrian party. Margaret was a formidable woman, intelligent, determined, and utterly devoted to securing her son's inheritance. Unlike her gentle, pious husband, Margaret understood power and was willing to use it ruthlessly to achieve her goals. She recognized Jasper's loyalty and capability, and she worked to ensure that he remained committed to the Lancastrian cause. In 1459, the fragile peace finally shattered. The Duke of York had been serving as Lieutenant of Ireland, essentially exiled from English politics. But now he returned with an armed force, determined to assert his rights and remove his enemies from power once and for all. War resumed, with both sides gathering armies and preparing for battle. King Henry's government ordered Jasper to take military action against Yorkist forces in Wales. Jasper responded by besieging and capturing Denbigh Castle, which belonged to the Duke of York and served as an important Yorkist stronghold in North Wales. By taking Denbigh, Jasper accomplished several objectives. He struck a blow against York's power, he secured an important strategic position, and he cut York's lines of communication between his English and Irish power bases. The capture of Denbigh Castle demonstrated Jasper's growing skills as a military commander. Siege warfare was a complex art that required understanding of engineering, logistics, tactics and persistence. Jasper had to position his forces to surround the castle, prevent supplies from reaching the garrison, build siege engines if necessary to batter the walls, and maintain his army in the field for however long the siege took. The fact that he successfully captured Denby showed that he had learned his lessons well and could translate his training into effective action. But in July of 1460, disaster struck the Lancastrian cause. At the Battle of Northampton, a Yorkist army defeated King Henry's forces and captured the king himself. This was not the first time Henry had been captured. It had happened at St. Albans in 1455, but this time the consequences were more serious. The Yorkists were now unwilling to maintain the fiction that they fought only against the king's evil advisors. They had decided that more fundamental changes were necessary. The Duke of York, emboldened by his victory at Northampton, made a stunning claim. He demanded to be recognized as King Henry's heir, effectively disinheriting Prince Edward, the king and queen's 7-year-old son. York argued that his claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III was superior to Henry's claim, and that justice required the crown pass to the rightful line rather than continue with the Lancastrian usurpers. This claim shocked even many of York's own supporters. Attacking the king's evil counsellors was one thing. Most nobles could accept that sometimes force was necessary to reform a corrupt government, but disinheriting the legitimate heir, setting aside the principle of primogeniture that determined succession, essentially arguing that might makes right when it came to the crown, this went too far for many. After lengthy debate, a compromise was reached in Parliament called the Act of Accord. King Henry would remain on the throne for his lifetime, but upon his death, the crown would pass to the Duke of York and his heirs, not to Prince Edward. It was a solution that satisfied no one. The Yorkists had to accept that Henry would continue as king, perhaps for decades more. The Lancastrians had to accept that Prince Edward had been disinherited, and everyone understood that Queen Margaret would never accept this arrangement. Margaret, who had fled north with her son after the Battle of Northampton, immediately began gathering forces to overturn the Act of Accord and restore her son's inheritance. She appealed to the nobles of northern England, to Scottish allies, and to anyone who valued legitimate royal succession over Yorkist might. Many nobles rallied to her banner, whether from loyalty to the Lancastrian dynasty, fear of Yorkist dominance, or genuine belief that Prince Edward's disinheritance was wrong. Jasper, holding out in his Welsh strongholds with Denby Castle still under his control, refused to submit or to accept the Yorkist victory. He maintained his loyalty to King Henry, to Queen Margaret, and to Prince Edward, and he waited for an opportunity to strike back at his enemies. He knew that Margaret was gathering forces in the north, and he began preparing to raise an army in Wales that could link up with the Queen's forces and overwhelm the Yorkists through sheer numbers. As 1460 turned to 1461, England stood on the brink of renewed and even more devastating civil war. The Act of Accord had not brought peace. It had only made clear that the conflict was now about the most fundamental question of all: who should wear the crown of England? The relatively limited conflicts of the previous years were about to explode into something far more destructive and bloody. For Jasper Tudor, at 29 years old, comfortable life of a prosperous earl surrounded by estates and revenues and honours was ending. The life of a warrior, an exile, and eventually a fugitive was about to begin. But even in the dark days ahead, even when defeat seemed total and continuing the fight seemed pointless, Jasper's loyalty would never waver. He had sworn an oath to his half-brother and to the House of Lancaster, and he would honour that oath no matter what it cost him. The winter that descended upon England as the year 1460 gave way to 1461 was one of the coldest in living memory. Snow fell thick and heavy across the realm, piling in drifts against cottage walls and castle gates, transforming the familiar landscape into a white wilderness that seemed alien and threatening. The great forests stood silent and stark, their bare branches heavy with ice that glittered in the weak winter sun. Rivers and streams froze solid, their surfaces becoming highways of ice that armies could cross without need of bridges. The roads, such as they were, became treacherous ribbons of frozen mud and snow, making travel slow and dangerous. But the physical cold of that terrible winter was nothing compared to the chill of fear and hatred that had settled over the kingdom. England was tearing itself apart, and everyone knew that the coming months would determine which royal house would rule and which would be destroyed. There could be no more compromises, no more temporary truces, no more pretending that reconciliation was possible. The conflict between Lancaster and York had reached a point where only total victory or total defeat was possible. In the north of England, Queen Margaret of Anjou had gathered a formidable army. Her forces included nobles from the northern counties who remained loyal to King Henry and Prince Edward, Scottish soldiers provided by Scotland's king in exchange for promises of English territory, and various other fighters drawn to the Lancastrian banner by loyalty, hope of profit, or simply the desire to be on what they hoped would be the winning side. The Northern Army was large, well-equipped, and determined to overturn the Act of Accord and restore Prince Edward's rights as heir to the throne. The army's approach toward London terrified the southern counties. Stories spread, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely false, of the Northern Army's behavior as it marched south. They were said to plunder and loot every town they passed through, to steal food and valuables from common people, to assault women, to burn buildings, and to act more like a foreign invading army than English soldiers fighting for their own king. Whether or not these stories were accurate, they were believed, and they created a climate of fear that would have important consequences. Opposing Queen Margaret's Northern Army were the Yorkist forces led by Richard, Duke of York, and his supporters. But York faced a strategic problem. His own power base was primarily in the Welsh Marches, Ireland, and parts of southern England. To confront Margaret's army coming from the north, he had to march his forces northward, leaving other areas vulnerable to Lancastrian attacks. This vulnerability was particularly acute in Wales and the western border regions, where Jasper Tudor remained a serious threat. Jasper still held several important castles. He had the loyalty of many Welsh fighters, and he was actively working to raise an army that could support Queen Margaret's cause. If Jasper could march eastward from Wales with a substantial force and link up with Margaret's Northern Army, the combined Lancastrian armies would vastly outnumber any force the Yorkists could field. To prevent this dangerous scenario, the Duke of York sent his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, to the west with orders to gather forces there and to block any Lancastrian army coming from Wales. Young Edward, just 18 years old, was already showing the military talent and charismatic leadership that would later make him a successful king. He set up his headquarters at Ludlow and Wigmore Castle in the Welsh Marches, the ancestral homes of his Mortimer forebears, and began gathering his own army from the western counties and from Welsh allies. Meanwhile, the Duke of York himself led an army north to confront Queen Margaret. The two forces met at Wakefield in Yorkshire on the 30th of December, 1460. What happened next was a catastrophe for the House of York. The battle was a crushing Lancastrian victory. The Duke of York himself was killed in the fighting. Some accounts say he died fighting bravely. Others suggest he was captured and executed after the battle. York's second son, the 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also killed, allegedly murdered while trying to flee the battlefield by John Clifford, Lord Clifford, who sought revenge for his own father's death at St. Albans. After the battle, in a grotesque display that revealed how savage the conflict had become, the heads of the Duke of York and his supporters were cut off and placed on spikes above the gates of the city of York. York's head was mockingly crowned with a paper crown to remind everyone of his pretensions to the throne. The Lancastrian victory at Wakefield seemed to confirm that Queen Margaret's cause was triumphant and that the Yorkist challenge had been crushed. But the death of the Duke of York did not end the Yorkist cause. Instead, it transformed it. York's claim to the throne now passed to his eldest surviving son, Edward, Earl of March. This young man, barely past his 18th birthday, suddenly found himself not merely the leader of a faction, but a claimant to the crown itself. If the Act of Accord was valid, if the Duke of York had indeed been the rightful heir to King Henry, then Edward of March was now the rightful King of England by his father's claim. Edward received the terrible news of his father's and brother's deaths while he was at his base in the Welsh marches. The grief and fury he must have felt at learning that his father and brother had been killed and their bodies mutilated is hard to imagine. But Edward did not allow his emotions to paralyze him. He understood that Queen Margaret's victorious army would soon be marching south toward London, and if the Yorkists were to have any hope of survival, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Edward's strategic situation required him to deal with the Lancastrian threat from Wales before he could move to confront Queen Margaret's northern army. His scouts and spies had brought him detailed intelligence about Jasper Tudor's activities, and Edward knew that Jasper was gathering a significant force that would march eastward from Wales into England. Jasper Tudor, for his part, had been working tirelessly through the early months of 1461 to raise an army for the Lancastrian cause. He drew on his Welsh estates and the loyalty of Welsh gentry and common people who admired the Tudor family and its connection to ancient Welsh princely lines. He gathered soldiers from among his own tenants and retainers, men who owed him feudal service and who would fight for their lord when called upon. But Jasper's army was not composed only of Welshmen. It also included mercenaries hired with Lancastrian funds, French and Breton soldiers experienced in war, willing to fight for whoever paid them. And there were Irish troops led by James Butler, Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, an important Lancastrian supporter who had his own reasons for opposing the Yorkists. This diverse force, speaking different languages and following different commanders, required careful coordination and management. Jasper was accompanied by his father, Owen Tudor, now 60 years old, but still vigorous enough to march with an army and to want to fight for the Lancastrian cause. Owen had personal reasons for hating the Yorkists. They had imprisoned him years earlier, and they had challenged and defeated the stepson he had loved, King Henry VI. For Owen, this campaign was a chance to strike back at his family's enemies and to fight alongside his son Jasper in defense of the Lancastrian dynasty that had raised the Tudor family to greatness. The Tudor army, probably numbering around 6,000 men, began marching northeast from Wales toward England in early February of 1461. Their objective was clear: to pass through the Welsh marches, enter England proper, and continue north until they could link up with Queen Margaret's victorious army. Once combined, the two Lancastrian forces would be unstoppable, able to march on London and sweep away all Yorkist resistance. But Edward of York had no intention of allowing this link-up to happen. His scouts tracked Jasper's movements carefully, reporting on the Lancastrian army's size, composition, and route. Edward studied the terrain and the likely paths the Welsh army would take, looking for the best place to intercept them. He consulted with his own commanders and local lords who knew the region well, gathering intelligence and planning his strategy. The weather favoured Edward's planning. The bitter cold had made the high passes through the mountains of Wales impassable, forcing Jasper's army to take the lower valley routes. This meant that Edward could predict with reasonable certainty where the Lancastrian army would emerge from Wales into the border regions, and it was there, at a place called Mortimer's Cross, where two valleys met near the River Lugg, that Edward decided to make his stand. Mortimer's Cross was well-chosen ground for a defensive battle. The geography channeled approaching forces into relatively narrow passages between hills, limiting the advantage that superior numbers might otherwise provide. Edward had time to position his forces carefully, to scout the surrounding area, and to prepare his battle plan. His army numbered perhaps 5,000 men, somewhat fewer than Jasper's force, but not so badly outnumbered that defeat was certain. Edward's commanders for the battle included some of the most capable men in his service. Sir William Herbert of Raglan was there, a Welsh nobleman who had chosen the Yorkist side and who would play an increasingly important role in Welsh affairs in the years to come. Sir Walter Devereux, Lord Ferrers, and Humphrey Stafford also commanded portions of the Yorkist army. These were experienced soldiers who understood how to manage men in combat and who could be trusted to execute Edward's battle plan. On the night before the battle, February 2nd or 3rd, sources differ on the exact date, both armies camped near the battlefield, making final preparations for the fight they knew would come with the morning. Soldiers checked their weapons and armor, making sure everything was in good condition. Archers counted their arrows and examined their bowstrings. Commanders gave final instructions to their men, explaining the battle plan and trying to inspire courage and determination. Chaplains heard confessions and administered communion, for every man knew that morning might be his last. The soldiers on both sides must have found it hard to sleep that night, despite their exhaustion from days of marching. The winter cold penetrated even thick cloaks and blankets, and the knowledge of impending battle makes rest difficult. Men thought of their families back home, of wives and children they might never see again, of mothers and fathers who would grieve if they fell. Some prayed quietly, asking God and the saints for protection and victory. Others sharpened weapons or cleaned armor, keeping their hands busy to quiet their anxious minds. For Jasper Tudor, that long night before battle must have been filled with anticipation and determination. At 29 years old, he had fought at St. Albans 6 years earlier, so he was not entirely inexperienced in combat. But this would be his first time commanding a substantial army, his first real test as a military leader. The responsibility of all those men's lives weighed on him. If he won, he would strike a major blow for the Lancastrian cause and open the road for Queen Margaret's triumphant march south. If he lost, those men would die, and the Lancastrian position in Wales would be shattered. His father Owen was with him, preparing for his own first major battle at age 60. The two men may have talked together that evening, father and son facing danger together, remembering the years since Catherine's death, when they had been separated and uncertain of their futures. Now they were together, fighting for the house that had honored them, defending the king who had acknowledged them as his brothers. Whatever happened in the morning, they would face it together. As dawn approached on that February morning in 1461, the mist lay heavy in the valleys, reducing visibility and creating an eerie, muffled atmosphere. Soldiers roused themselves from fitful sleep, ate whatever breakfast they could manage, and began preparing for battle. Armor was donned, a complex process requiring help from squires and fellow soldiers. Weapons were taken up. Commanders gathered their men and began moving into battle formations. And then, as the sun began to rise and its light started to penetrate the morning mist, something extraordinary happened. Instead of one sun appearing in the eastern sky, there appeared to be 3 suns, glowing in the heavens like a vision from divine revelation. This phenomenon, called a parhelion or sundog, was caused by ice crystals in the extremely cold air refracting and reflecting sunlight in unusual ways. But to medieval soldiers, who had no knowledge of atmospheric optics, this was a supernatural sign, an omen from God or the devil about the outcome of the battle. The Yorkist soldiers who saw the 3 suns were terrified. Many began to panic, convinced that this strange sight predicted their doom. Whispers and shouts spread through the ranks as men pointed at the sky, made the sign of the cross, and wondered whether they should flee before the battle even began. The fear was palpable and spreading rapidly, threatening to break the army's cohesion before the Lancastrians even attacked. But young Edward of York showed the quick wit and leadership that would become his hallmark. Seeing his army's panic, he immediately took action to reinterpret the omen. He rode among his men, pointing to the 3 suns in the sky and proclaiming that this was not a sign of doom, but a blessing. The 3 suns, he announced, represented the Holy Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. The Trinity was appearing to them on the morning of battle to show that heaven favored the Yorkist cause, that God himself supported their just fight against the Lancastrian usurpers. Edward's reinterpretation was brilliant and effective. The terrified soldiers, desperate to believe that the strange omen was good rather than bad, eagerly accepted this explanation. Their fear turned to excitement and confidence. If God himself was showing them favor, how could they lose? The panic that had threatened to destroy the Yorkist army before the battle even began, instead transformed into renewed determination and courage. Edward would never forget this moment or its impact. Later, after he became king, he would adopt the sun as one of his personal badges, incorporating it into his heraldry in a design called the Sun in Splendor, a golden sun with long rays extending in all directions. This symbol would become strongly associated with the House of York and with Edward personally, a constant reminder of that February morning when his quick thinking and bold leadership had turned potential disaster into a powerful morale boost for his army. With his men's confidence restored, Edward deployed his forces for battle. The Yorkist army was arranged in the traditional medieval battle formation of 3 battles or divisions: a vanguard, a central battle, and a rearguard. Edward himself commanded the centre, the most important position. Sir William Herbert commanded the left wing, while Sir Walter Devereux led the right. The archers, those invaluable longbowmen who had won so many English victories in France, were positioned at the front where they could rain arrows on the approaching enemy. The Lancastrian army, advancing through the morning mist toward what they knew must be the Yorkist position, was similarly organized into 3 divisions. Jasper Tudor commanded one of these divisions, likely the centre or one of the wings. James Butler, Earl of Wiltshire, commanded another. Owen Tudor probably commanded the 3rd, though the exact command structure is not entirely clear from the surviving sources. As the 2 armies came within sight of each other through the thinning mist, the phase of the battle that medieval soldiers called the archery duel began. Hundreds of archers on both sides drew their powerful longbows and began loosing arrows at the enemy. The sound must have been extraordinary, the deep thrumming of hundreds of bowstrings releasing almost simultaneously, the whistle of arrows in flight, the clattering and thudding as arrows struck armor, shields, the ground, or found their marks in unprotected flesh. An English archer could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute with reasonable accuracy, and a force of several hundred archers could darken the sky with missiles. The arrow storm was terrifying even for armored men. Arrows could penetrate some types of armor, and even when they didn't penetrate, the impact of being struck repeatedly by arrows was physically and psychologically devastating. Men tried to shelter behind shields, to keep their heads down, to present as small a target as possible, while still watching for the right moment to advance. After some time of this arrow exchange, it might have been minutes or it might have been longer. Time becomes difficult to judge in the chaos of battle. One side or both began to advance. The exact sequence of the battle is unclear from the fragmentary sources that survive. What is certain is that hard, brutal hand-to-hand fighting occurred between the infantry forces of both armies. Medieval hand-to-hand combat was nothing like the choreographed sword fight seen in modern movies. It was a desperate, exhausting, terrifying struggle, where men hacked at each other with swords, axes, and polearms, trying to find gaps in their opponent's armor, or simply to batter them into submission through repeated blows. The noise was overwhelming. The clash of metal on metal, the shouts and screams of wounded men, the commands of officers trying to control the chaos, the thunder of hoofbeats if cavalry charged. The fighting was intensely physical and exhausting. Swinging a sword or axe while wearing 30 to 50 pounds of armor on uncertain footing, surrounded by enemies trying to kill you, in cold weather that made breathing difficult. This drained a man's strength rapidly. Battles could not last too long at this intensity. Either one side would break and flee, or both sides would reach a kind of exhaustion where the fighting slowed or stopped temporarily while men caught their breath. At some point in the battle, whether early or late we cannot know, the Lancastrian line began to buckle under Yorkist pressure. One source suggests that the Earl of Wiltshire's division was defeated and driven from the field early in the battle, creating a gap in the Lancastrian line that Edward's forces exploited. Another account indicates that Owen Tudor attempted a flanking maneuver around the Yorkist left, but was himself outflanked and defeated. Whatever the exact tactical details, the result was a crushing Yorkist victory. The Lancastrian army broke and fled in disarray. The organized formations dissolved into a panicked mob of men trying to save their lives. Some fled back toward Wales, retracing the route they had marched so hopefully just days before. Others scattered in all directions, trying to find somewhere to hide, some way to escape the pursuing Yorkist soldiers. The pursuit and slaughter that followed the battle was extensive and bloody. Yorkist cavalry and infantry pursued the fleeing Lancastrians for miles. Contemporary sources claim that Lancastrian soldiers were hunted as far as Hereford, approximately 17 miles from the battlefield. This pursuit would have taken hours, and during all that time, Yorkist soldiers were killing every Lancastrian they could catch. Some estimates suggest that as many as 4,000 Lancastrians died in the battle and the subsequent pursuit, though this number may be exaggerated. Jasper Tudor, showing the survival instincts and quick thinking that would serve him well throughout his long career, managed to escape from the disaster at Mortimer's Cross. How exactly he got away is not recorded in the sources. Perhaps he was among the first to realize the battle was lost and made his escape before the Yorkist pursuit was fully organized. Perhaps he had kept a reserve of mounted men who could carry him to safety. Perhaps he simply rode hard and was lucky enough to evade capture. However he managed it, Jasper survived to fight another day, fleeing first to Ireland and then to Scotland, where he could find temporary refuge. But his father, Owen Tudor, was not so fortunate. Owen, the 60-year-old Welshman who had married a queen and fathered a line of princes, was captured by Yorkist forces during or after the battle. He was taken to Hereford, that ancient cathedral city on the River Wye, along with other high-ranking prisoners including John Throckmorton and Henry Scudamore. Young Edward of York, newly become the Duke of York by his father's death, with his father's and brother's mutilated heads still displayed on pikes at the city of York as a grim reminder of Lancastrian brutality, was in no mood for mercy. He had just won his first major victory as an independent commander. He had avenged at least partially the deaths of his father and brother. He had blocked the Lancastrian attempt to bring Welsh forces to Queen Margaret's support, and he intended to make an example of the Lancastrian leaders who had fallen into his hands. Edward ordered the execution of the captured Lancastrian commanders. It was a cold political calculation. Executing these men would strike fear into his enemies, would show that he was willing to be ruthless, and would eliminate experienced enemy leaders who might otherwise be ransomed and return to fight against him again. The practice of executing high-ranking prisoners rather than holding them for ransom, as had been more common in earlier wars, was becoming increasingly typical as the Wars of the Roses progressed and grew more savage. Owen Tudor was held at the Green Dragon Inn in Hereford while awaiting his execution. According to the chronicles written years later, Owen did not believe he would actually be executed. He was the stepfather of King Henry VI. He was father to the Earl of Pembroke and the late Earl of Richmond. He was of an age where chivalric tradition often spared elderly captives. Surely, he seems to have reasoned, he would be held for ransom or perhaps imprisoned, but not killed. But when the guards came for him, when Owen was led out into the streets of Hereford and saw the execution block set up in the market square, the terrible reality finally penetrated his confidence. The executioner roughly tore the red collar from Owen's doublet. This collar, or livery collar, was a mark of gentle status and privilege, worn to show that one belonged to a great household or held rank in society. Its removal symbolically stripped Owen of his status, reducing him to a common traitor about to die a traitor's death. In that moment, as Owen finally understood that death was upon him, he is reported to have said words that have echoed down through the centuries, words that captured both pride in his extraordinary life and sorrow at its ending. "That head," he said, looking at the block where his neck would be laid, "shall lie on the stock that was wont to lie on Queen Catherine's lap." It was a poignant and tragic statement. Owen was remembering the love he had shared with Catherine, those secret years when a Welsh gentleman and an English queen had defied all convention to be together. He was remembering nights when his head had rested on Catherine's lap as they talked and laughed together, years when they had built a family despite all the obstacles society had placed in their way. Now that same head would rest on the executioner's block, about to be severed from his body by the axe. Owen Tudor was beheaded in the market square at Hereford. The execution would have been carried out in full public view, with a crowd of townspeople watching. The actual beheading was quick. A skilled executioner could sever a head with one blow, but the indignity and horror of public execution, the humiliation of dying as a condemned traitor, and the brutality of having one's body desecrated would have made Owen's last moments terrible indeed. After the execution, Owen's head was displayed on the market cross in Hereford as a warning to others who might oppose the House of York. But even in death, Owen inspired loyalty and affection from those who had known or heard of him. A local woman, described by the chroniclers as mad or simple-minded, took it upon herself to tend to Owen's severed head. She washed the blood from his face, combed his hair to make him presentable, and placed lighted candles around the head in a gesture of respect, mourning, and quasi-religious veneration. This touching scene, recorded in several sources, captured something of the tragedy and the human cost of the Wars of the Roses. For Jasper Tudor, the news of his father's execution, coming on top of the devastating defeat at Mortimer's Cross and his own desperate flight into exile, must have been crushing. He had already lost his mother when he was a small child. His brother Edmund had died just 4 years earlier. Now his father, who had survived so much adversity and risen so far despite his modest origins, had been killed by the Yorkists in a brutal display of victor's justice. The personal losses were terrible, but the strategic situation was even worse. The Yorkist victory at Mortimer's Cross meant that Jasper's Welsh forces had been destroyed, that Queen Margaret would receive no help from Wales, and that Edward of York had secured his western flank and could now march to confront the northern army. The Lancastrian plan to overwhelm the Yorkists through superior numbers had failed before the two armies could even link up. Indeed, while Jasper was fleeing to Ireland and mourning his father's death, events were moving rapidly elsewhere in England. Queen Margaret's northern army had advanced south and met the forces of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, at the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17th. Margaret won that battle and recovered her husband, King Henry VI, who had been a captive of the Yorkists since the Battle of Northampton. But instead of immediately marching on London, Margaret hesitated, perhaps influenced by reports of Edward's victory at Mortimer's Cross, perhaps worried about supply problems, or perhaps uncertain of her welcome in London given the capital's fear of her northern army's reputation for looting. This hesitation proved fatal to the Lancastrian cause. Edward of York, emboldened by his victory at Mortimer's Cross and seeing his opportunity, marched his army to London. The city, fearful of Queen Margaret's northern soldiers and impressed by Edward's youth, vigour and recent victory, welcomed him as a deliverer. On March 4th, 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV of England by the Archbishop of Canterbury and a gathering of nobles and citizens in London. It was an extraordinary moment. Edward was just 18 years old, one of the youngest people ever to claim the English throne. His claim rested not on any act of Parliament or formal legal process, but on his military success, the support of powerful nobles like Warwick, and the doctrine that his father had been the rightful heir by the Act of Accord. It was a naked seizure of power, but it was successful. King Edward, for such he now was, did not rest on this triumph. He understood that Queen Margaret still had a substantial army in the north, and that King Henry was with her. To secure his crown, Edward needed to crush the Lancastrian forces decisively. He quickly gathered a large army and marched north to seek battle with Margaret's forces. The two armies met at Towton in Yorkshire on March 29th, 1461. Palm Sunday that year fell on that date, adding religious significance to what would become the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The fighting lasted all day in a snowstorm, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. Contemporary estimates, which may be exaggerated, but which convey the scale of the slaughter, suggest that as many as 28,000 men died at Towton. By evening, the Lancastrian army was shattered. Queen Margaret, King Henry, and young Prince Edward fled from the battlefield and eventually made their way to Scotland and then to France, beginning years of exile. The Lancastrian cause seemed utterly destroyed. King Edward IV was triumphant, his position secure, his enemies scattered or dead. For Jasper Tudor, watching helplessly from his exile in Scotland as the Lancastrian world collapsed, the situation seemed hopeless. His father was dead. His half-brother King Henry was a fugitive. His lands were declared forfeit by the New Yorkist king. His title of Earl of Pembroke was given to William Herbert, one of Edward's most trusted supporters, who also took control of Pembroke Castle and custody of young Henry Tudor. Jasper's nephew, now 4 years old, was now being raised in a Yorkist household, away from his mother, potentially being taught to forget his Tudor heritage and his Lancastrian bloodline. The boy might grow up believing that the House of York was rightful and that his own family were merely defeated rebels whose cause deserved to be forgotten. Everything Jasper had built, his position as Earl of Pembroke, his power in Wales, his comfortable life as a great noble, had been swept away in just 2 months of catastrophic defeats. The winter of 1461 had indeed been a winter of blood, and that blood had included his father's. The Yorkist triumph seemed complete and permanent, but Jasper Tudor, though beaten and exiled, was not broken. Despite losing everything, despite having every reason to give up and accept the new reality, despite the fact that continuing to fight seemed pointless, Jasper's loyalty to the House of Lancaster and to his half-brother King Henry never wavered. He would spend the next 10 years trying to reverse the disaster, mounting invasion after invasion, fighting battles he usually lost, becoming a wanted fugitive with a price on his head, but never giving up and never surrendering. The defeat at Mortimer's Cross and the execution of Owen Tudor marked the end of one chapter in Jasper's life and the beginning of another. The comfortable Earl was gone. In his place stood a determined, loyal, increasingly skilled guerrilla fighter who would refuse to accept defeat no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. The years of his greatest trials were beginning, but so too were the years that would forge him into the man who would ultimately help place his nephew on the throne of England and establish the Tudor dynasty. The sun rose over the port of Harfleur in Normandy on the first day of August, 1485, illuminating a scene of purposeful activity that had been building for weeks. Ships were being loaded with supplies, weapons, armor, and provisions for an army that would cross the Channel and attempt what many thought was impossible: the overthrow of King Richard III and the placing of an unknown exile on the throne of England. Jasper Tudor stood on the dock watching the preparations, his mind racing through the 1,000 details that could determine success or failure. At 54 years old, he had spent more than half his life fighting for the Lancastrian cause, enduring defeats, exile, poverty, and repeated disappointments. Now finally, he had another chance, perhaps his last chance, to accomplish what he had been working toward for 3 decades. The invasion force was not large by the standards of medieval warfare. Jasper had approximately 2,000 men under his command, gathered from various sources. About half were French and Breton mercenaries, professional soldiers hired with money provided by the French government. The rest were the English and Welsh exiles who had lived in Brittany and France for years, waiting for this moment when they could finally return home. They were a mixed group. Some were experienced soldiers who had fought in previous campaigns. Others were younger men who had grown up in exile and had never seen England. And still others were nobles and gentlemen whose military experience was limited, but whose political support was valuable. Henry Tudor himself was at the center of all this activity, though he remained remarkably calm for a young man about to stake everything on a single military campaign. At 28 years old, Henry had lived in exile since he was 13. He had been shaped by those years under Jasper's guidance into a cautious, calculating, thoughtful man who did not act rashly, but who could be decisively bold when necessary. He wore simple clothing rather than the elaborate costume of a king, preferring to avoid drawing attention to himself until the moment was right. The plan that Jasper and Henry had developed was based on one crucial advantage: their Welsh heritage. Jasper understood that Wales, the land where he had been Earl of Pembroke, where the Tudor family was remembered and respected, where many people still maintained loyalty to the memory of the old Welsh princes, could provide the support they needed. If they landed in Wales rather than in England, if they marched through Welsh territory gathering Welsh recruits as they went, they might be able to build their small invasion force into an army large enough to face Richard. The specific landing site they had chosen was Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire, the very region where Jasper had once been Earl, where Pembroke Castle had been his headquarters, where people still remembered the Tudor name. Milford Haven was a natural deep-water harbour, easily accessible from the sea, and close to areas where Jasper had maintained contacts and where he believed support could be found. On August 1st, 1485, the invasion fleet finally sailed from Harfleur. The ships, probably between 20 and 30 vessels of various sizes, carried Jasper's army, along with supplies, horses for the commanders and mounted soldiers, weapons, and everything else needed for a military campaign. The crossing was anxious. The weather could turn bad quickly in the Channel. Storms could scatter the fleet, or they might encounter English naval forces that would attack before they could land. But fortune favoured them. The crossing was relatively smooth, and by August 7th, the fleet entered Milford Haven without opposition. The ships navigated carefully into the harbour and found landing sites where the men could disembark. As the soldiers and exiles stepped onto Welsh soil, for many of them, onto English-controlled soil for the first time in years, there must have been powerful emotions: relief at having survived the crossing, anxiety about what lay ahead, hope that finally they might succeed, and for many, joy at returning to the homeland they had been forced to leave. Jasper was the first significant commander to step off the ships. This was his homeland. He had been born not far from this coast. He had ruled these lands as Earl of Pembroke. The people here spoke Welsh, the language his father had spoken, the language he himself had learned and used. As word spread through the surrounding countryside that Jasper Tudor had returned, leading an army that included his nephew Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne, people began to react. Henry Tudor, landing in Wales for the first time since his desperate escape 14 years earlier, knelt and kissed the ground. According to accounts written later, he recited Psalm 43, "Judge me, O God, and plead my cause against an ungodly nation. O deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man," and then made a sign of the cross in the sand. This was good political theatre, showing humility and piety, asking for God's blessing on his enterprise, demonstrating that he came not as a foreign invader, but as a rightful heir returning home. Jasper immediately began implementing the plan they had discussed for months. He sent messengers throughout Wales carrying letters and proclamations announcing their arrival and calling on loyal Welsh people to join Henry's army. He specifically reached out to Rhys ap Thomas and John Savage, two powerful Welsh noblemen who he believed might be persuaded to support the invasion, despite having previously served Richard. Rhys ap Thomas was particularly important. He was one of the most powerful men in South Wales, commanding significant military resources and enjoying the loyalty of many Welsh gentry and soldiers. Richard had made Rhys his principal lieutenant in Wales, giving him substantial authority and trusting him to maintain order and loyalty. But Rhys had reasons to be dissatisfied with Richard's rule, and the Tudor family's Welsh heritage and connections might persuade him to switch sides. The initial days after landing were crucial. Jasper knew from bitter experience that Richard would respond swiftly once he learned of the invasion. They needed to move quickly, to gather as many recruits as possible, to demonstrate momentum and success that would encourage others to join them rather than oppose them. An invasion that stalled immediately after landing, that failed to gather local support, would collapse before it truly began. As the army began marching inland from Milford Haven, people came to see what was happening. Some came out of curiosity, some out of loyalty to the Tudor name, some because they saw an opportunity for profit or advancement. Jasper spoke to them in Welsh, emphasizing Henry's Welsh blood through the Tudor family, reminding them of the old connection between the Tudors and the ancient Welsh princes, promising that a Tudor king would honor Wales and the Welsh people. The psychological impact of Jasper's presence cannot be overstated. Here was a man who had fought for 30 years without giving up, who had endured every defeat and disappointment, but had never wavered in his loyalty or his determination. His reputation for steadfastness and courage was well known. When people saw that Jasper Tudor believed in Henry's cause enough to risk everything on this invasion, it gave them confidence that this was not just another doomed rebellion, but a serious attempt that might actually succeed. Gradually, as the army marched through Wales, its numbers began to grow. At first, the additions were modest. A few dozen men here, 100 there, individual knights and gentlemen deciding to throw in their lot with the Tudor cause. But as news spread that the invasion was gathering strength rather than collapsing, more substantial groups began to join. Rhys ap Thomas, after some hesitation and no doubt careful calculation of the risks and potential rewards, decided to support Henry. He brought with him a significant force, perhaps as many as 2,000 men, that transformed the invasion army from a relatively small force into something much more substantial. John Savage also joined with his followers. Other Welsh nobles and gentry, seeing that the invasion was gaining momentum and wanting to be on the winning side, brought their own retainers and tenants to swell Henry's ranks. By the time Henry's army crossed from Wales into England and began marching through the Midlands toward London, it had grown to perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men. Still not a huge army by medieval standards, but large enough to be taken seriously, large enough that a battle between Henry and Richard would have an uncertain outcome. As the Tudor army marched, Jasper served as one of Henry's principal military advisors and commanders. He helped plan the route of march, selected camping sites, organized foraging for food and supplies, arranged the order of march, and prepared for the battle he knew must come. His decades of military experience, including all his defeats as well as his few victories, had taught him what worked and what didn't. He passed this knowledge on to Henry and the other commanders, helping to ensure that the army functioned as effectively as possible. News of the invasion reached King Richard while he was at Nottingham Castle. Richard responded exactly as Jasper had expected, swiftly and decisively. Richard was an experienced military commander who had fought in many of the Wars of the Roses battles. He understood that he needed to confront and defeat this invasion before it could grow any stronger, or before more nobles decided to join Henry's cause. Richard sent out summons to all his supporters, calling them to bring their forces and join him to crush the rebellion. The two armies approached each other through the Midlands, both commanders knowing that a decisive battle would soon occur. Richard had the larger army, probably around 10,000 to 12,000 men to Henry's 5,000 or 6,000. Richard also had more experienced commanders, better equipment for his troops, and the psychological advantage of being the anointed king, defending his throne against a rebel pretender. By all conventional military calculus, Richard should win the coming battle. But Richard faced problems that were not visible in simple troop counts. Many of his nominal supporters were uncertain in their loyalty. Some English nobles, particularly those with Yorkist backgrounds, were deeply troubled by Richard's seizure of the throne and the probable murder of the princes. They questioned whether Richard deserved their loyalty. Some who marched with Richard's army had already secretly decided that they would not fight for him if given any alternative. The two most important of these uncertain supporters were Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley. The Stanley brothers commanded substantial forces, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men between them, that were ostensibly part of Richard's army. But Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, making the Stanleys Henry's stepfather and step-uncle. Richard understood that the Stanleys' loyalty was questionable, but he could not afford to alienate them before the battle. Richard tried to ensure their loyalty by keeping Thomas Stanley's son, Lord Strange, as a hostage, threatening to execute him if the Stanleys betrayed their king. On August 21st, 1485, the two armies made camp within a few miles of each other near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Both sides knew that battle would come with the dawn. Soldiers prepared their weapons and armor. Chaplains heard confessions and conducted religious services. Commanders reviewed battle plans and gave final instructions to their subordinates. It was a long night for everyone, filled with tension and fear and anticipation. For Jasper, camping with Henry's army on the eve of battle, this was the culmination of everything he had worked for since that terrible winter day at Mortimer's Cross 24 years earlier when his father had been executed. Every defeat, every year of exile, every moment of doubt and discouragement had led to this moment. Tomorrow would determine whether those decades of loyalty and struggle had any meaning, or whether the Tudor cause would die on the field along with Henry and himself. Henry himself spent much of the night in discussion with Jasper and his other commanders, reviewing the plan for the battle. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew that Richard was an experienced commander with veteran troops, but they also knew that Richard's army included uncertain elements, that the Stanley forces were potentially unreliable, and that if they could create the right conditions, victory might be possible despite the odds. Dawn came early on August 22nd, 1485. As the sun rose over the Leicestershire countryside, both armies began preparing for battle. Soldiers donned their armor, a time-consuming process that required help from companions and squires. Weapons were checked one final time. Battle formations were organized, with infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings. Banners were unfurled, displaying the symbols of the various commanders and noble houses represented in each army. Richard deployed his forces on Ambion Hill, taking the higher ground that would give his troops an advantage in the coming fight. His army was organized in 3 main divisions, or battles, as they were called in medieval warfare. The Duke of Norfolk commanded the vanguard. Richard himself commanded the center with the largest portion of the army, and the Earl of Northumberland commanded the rearguard. The Stanley forces, commanded by Lord Thomas Stanley and Sir William Stanley, were positioned off to one side, nominally part of Richard's army, but maintaining a distinct formation that could act independently. Henry's smaller army deployed in the lower ground, also organized into 3 main divisions. The Earl of Oxford, an experienced military commander who had fought for the Lancastrian cause for years, commanded the vanguard, the force that would make initial contact with the enemy. Henry himself was in the center with the main body of troops. Jasper Tudor commanded one of the other divisions, likely the rearguard, where his experience and steadiness would be crucial for maintaining order and preventing the army from breaking if the battle went badly. The battle began with the vanguards advancing toward each other. Oxford's men and Norfolk's men clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The noise must have been overwhelming. The clash of weapons on armor, the shouts and screams of fighting men, the thunder of hoofbeats as cavalry charged, the commands of officers trying to maintain some order in the chaos. Medieval battles were not the organized, controlled affairs depicted in many later paintings and movies. They were desperate, confused, terrifying struggles, where men hacked at each other with swords, axes, and polearms, trying to kill their opponents while staying alive themselves. The fighting was fierce, and for a time, the outcome was unclear. Norfolk's larger and more experienced force pressed hard against Oxford's men, threatening to break through and destroy the Tudor vanguard. But Oxford was an able commander who kept his troops together, prevented them from panicking and routing, and managed to hold his position despite the pressure. From his position on Ambion Hill, King Richard watched the battle develop. He could see that his forces were engaged with Henry's vanguard, but that the Stanley forces were not moving to support him as they should have. The Stanleys remained in their separate positions, watching but not engaging, clearly waiting to see how the battle developed before committing themselves. This must have infuriated Richard, but he could do nothing about it in the middle of battle. Then Richard saw an opportunity. Looking across the battlefield with his experienced commander's eye, Richard noticed that Henry Tudor himself was somewhat separated from the main fighting, positioned with a relatively small bodyguard of personal troops. If Richard could reach Henry and kill him, the battle would be over instantly. Henry's death would destroy Tudor morale, the rebel army would collapse, and the threat would be eliminated permanently. Richard made a bold, desperate decision. He would personally lead a cavalry charge directly at Henry, attempting to kill the rebel leader in single combat or through overwhelming force. It was an extraordinarily risky move. If he failed, if he was killed in the attempt, his own army would collapse just as surely as Henry's would. But Richard was a brave man and an experienced warrior, and he believed he could succeed. Richard gathered a force of mounted knights and men-at-arms. Accounts vary on the exact number, but it was probably several dozen to perhaps 100 horsemen, and led them in a thundering charge across the battlefield directly toward Henry's position. Richard was easily recognizable in his royal armor, probably wearing his crown or a crown circlet, to make clear who he was, carrying the royal standard. Henry's bodyguard, seeing this cavalry charge bearing down on them, formed up to protect their commander. The resulting melee was intense and close. Richard fought with extraordinary courage and skill, personally killing Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, and unhorsing Sir John Cheney, one of Henry's bodyguard who was renowned for his size and strength. For a few desperate minutes, it seemed that Richard might actually reach Henry and kill him, winning the battle through personal valor. But then the Stanley forces, which had been watching from the sidelines throughout the battle, made their move. Sir William Stanley, seeing Richard isolated and vulnerable in his charge against Henry, ordered his 3,000 men to intervene. The Stanley forces crashed into Richard's cavalry from the side, surrounding the king and his knights, cutting them off from the rest of their army. The fighting around King Richard became desperate. He was surrounded by enemies, his horse was killed under him, and he fought on foot against overwhelming numbers. Some sources claim that Richard was offered a horse to escape, that someone called out, "Fly, my lord, fly," but that Richard responded, "I will not budge a foot," or words to that effect. Whether or not this exchange actually occurred, Richard did not flee. He fought to the end, killing several more opponents even after being unhorsed, until finally he was struck down by multiple blows and killed in the melee. King Richard III died on Bosworth Field, the last English king to die in battle. His crown, or perhaps a crown circlet he had been wearing, was found on the battlefield, supposedly under a hawthorn bush, and was brought to Henry Tudor. Lord Stanley took the crown and placed it on Henry's head, right there on the battlefield, proclaiming him King Henry VII of England. For Jasper Tudor, watching from his position with his division of the army, seeing the Stanley intervention, and then seeing Richard's death and his nephew proclaimed king. The moment must have been almost overwhelming. After 30 years of fighting, after countless defeats and disappointments, after watching his father executed and his half-brother murdered, after spending 14 years in exile, after everything he had endured, finally the Tudor cause had triumphed. His nephew was king. The Lancastrian struggle had not been in vain. The loyalty and sacrifice had been rewarded beyond anything Jasper could have imagined. The Battle of Bosworth Field was over. Richard's army, seeing their king dead and the Stanleys supporting Henry, quickly disintegrated. Some soldiers fled the battlefield. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered. The Earl of Northumberland, who had commanded Richard's rearguard, never actually engaged in the fighting. His troops stood idle throughout the battle, and historians still debate whether Northumberland had secretly decided to betray Richard or simply decided not to risk his men when the outcome was uncertain. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the traditional scenes following medieval combat, the wounded crying out for help, the victors searching the battlefield for loot and valuables, the defeated soldiers being rounded up as prisoners. Richard's body, stripped of its armor and even its clothing, was unceremoniously slung over a horse and taken to Leicester, where it would be displayed to prove that the king was truly dead, and then buried without ceremony in the church of the Grey Friars. But for Henry, for Jasper, and for all the English exiles who had fought at Bosworth, the real work was just beginning. They had won a battle, but they had not yet secured a kingdom. Henry had been proclaimed king on the battlefield, but he still needed to reach London, establish his government, ensure that potential rivals submitted to his authority, and transform military victory into legitimate, stable rule. In the days immediately following Bosworth, Henry's army marched toward London, gathering support and acceptance as they went. Nobles who had fought for Richard now hastened to make their submission to the new king. Towns and cities opened their gates to Henry without resistance. The kingdom seemed to recognize that a decisive change had occurred, and that resistance would be pointless and dangerous. On September 3rd, 1485, Henry entered London in triumph. Jasper rode beside his nephew, sharing in the moment of glory. The city gave Henry a magnificent welcome, with celebrations and ceremonies that marked his acceptance as the rightful king. Henry took up residence in the Tower of London, not as a prisoner as his half-uncle Henry VI had been, but as king. On October 30th, 1485, Henry VII was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony attended by nobles from throughout the kingdom. Jasper stood among the witnesses to this coronation, his heart surely full of emotions too complex to articulate. Pride in his nephew's achievement, satisfaction at finally seeing his long struggle rewarded, relief that the years of exile and war were over, sorrow for all those who had not lived to see this day, his father Owen, his brother Edmund, his half-brother King Henry VI, all the thousands who had died in the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's first parliament met in November of 1485. Among the many acts of this parliament was the formal recognition of Henry's right to the throne and the attainder, legal condemnation, of Richard III and his supporters. But perhaps the most personally significant act for Jasper was Henry's creation of his uncle as Duke of Bedford on October 27th, just 3 days before Henry's own coronation. The Dukedom of Bedford was one of the highest ranks in English nobility, and it had particular resonance as it had previously been held by John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, the brother of King Henry V and uncle of King Henry VI. By granting this title to Jasper, Henry was honouring his uncle in the most magnificent way possible, elevating him to a rank second only to the royal princes themselves, acknowledging his decades of loyalty and his crucial role in Henry's success. With the dukedom came lands and revenues that made Jasper one of the wealthiest men in England. His old earldom of Pembroke was restored to him, along with extensive other estates in Wales and England. After decades of poverty and exile, Jasper was now rich beyond anything he had known even in his youth. At 54 years old, having spent his entire adult life fighting and struggling, Jasper could finally rest, enjoy comfort and security, and live out his remaining years in the honour and prosperity he had earned. The transformation in Jasper Tudor's life after Bosworth was so complete and sudden that it must have felt almost dreamlike. In August of 1485, he had been a 54-year-old exile, leading a desperate invasion with uncertain prospects. By November of 1485, he was the Duke of Bedford, one of the greatest nobles in England, an uncle to the king, wealthy beyond measure, and secure in a position he had spent 3 decades fighting to achieve. But Jasper was not a man to rest on his laurels or to retire from active involvement in governance simply because he had achieved comfort and security. He understood that his nephew's position on the throne, while secured by military victory, still required careful political management and the establishment of legitimacy that went beyond conquest. Henry needed trusted advisors who were absolutely loyal, who understood the political complexities of the kingdom, and who could help establish the new Tudor dynasty on a firm foundation. Jasper was determined to be one of those advisors. On November 7th, 1485, the exact date carefully chosen for its astrological significance and political meaning, Jasper married Catherine Woodville at the royal manor of Bedminster in Somerset. This marriage was both personally significant and politically important. Catherine was the daughter of Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, and Jacquetta of Luxembourg, making her sister to Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of King Edward IV. When Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, on January 18, 1486, Jasper's wife Catherine became the aunt of the new queen. This meant that Jasper, already the king's uncle by blood, now became also connected to the queen's family by marriage. These interlocking family relationships helped bind together the formerly warring houses of Lancaster and York, creating family ties that made further conflict less likely, and helped legitimize Henry's rule by demonstrating that the Tudors were connected to both the Lancastrian and Yorkist royal lines. The marriage also brought Jasper a ready-made family. Catherine was a widow of approximately 30 years of age, who had been married twice before, first to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had been executed for his rebellion against Richard III, and before that, briefly and without issue, to Harry Grey. From her marriage to Buckingham, Catherine had several children, including Edward Stafford, who would later become Duke of Buckingham himself. Jasper thus became stepfather to these Stafford children, taking on responsibilities for their upbringing and welfare. By all accounts, the marriage was a happy one, or at least a successful partnership. Catherine was an experienced noblewoman who understood the complexities of court life and the demands of managing great estates. She had survived the political turbulence of previous decades with her dignity and position intact. She was a suitable partner for a man of Jasper's rank and experience. There is no indication that the marriage produced children of their own, which is unsurprising given that Jasper was 54 years old at the time of marriage, and Catherine was already about 30, with children from previous marriages. As Duke of Bedford, Jasper received grants of land and position that made him one of the most powerful men in Wales and the Welsh Marches. He was made Chief Justice of South Wales and Justice of North Wales, giving him responsibility for law enforcement and justice administration throughout Wales. He received Pembroke Castle and many other properties in Wales that had once been part of his earldom of Pembroke, and which he now held as part of his expanded ducal holdings. He was also made constable of numerous royal castles, including Gloucester, Bristol, Exeter, Barnard Castle, Scarborough Castle, Carmarthen Castle, and many others. These positions were not merely honorary. As constable of these castles, Jasper was responsible for their maintenance, garrison, and defensive readiness. He appointed castellans and other officers to manage these fortresses on his behalf, creating a network of power and influence throughout western and southwestern England and Wales. In addition to his Welsh responsibilities, Jasper received estates in England, including South Pembroke in Wiltshire and various properties in Devon. The revenues from all these holdings made Jasper immensely wealthy, probably receiving income of £2,000 to £3,000 per year, an enormous sum that placed him among the very richest men in the kingdom outside the royal family itself. King Henry VII relied heavily on his uncle during the first years of his reign. Jasper sat on the royal council, the small group of trusted advisors who helped the king make decisions about policy, military matters, foreign affairs, and all the complex business of running a kingdom. Henry valued Jasper's experience, his loyalty, and his sound judgment. Unlike some advisors who had their own ambitions and agendas, Jasper could be trusted absolutely. His only interest was in his nephew's success and in the stability and prosperity of the realm. But Henry's hold on the throne was not immediately secure. The victory at Bosworth had placed him on the throne, but there were still Yorkist claimants and supporters who questioned his right to rule. The young Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV's brother, had a claim that some considered stronger than Henry's, and there were rumours that one or both of the princes in the Tower might have survived Richard's attempt to murder them, creating potential rival claimants. In 1486, these concerns materialised into an actual rebellion. A young man named Lambert Simnel was presented by Yorkist conspirators as Edward, Earl of Warwick, claiming that he was the rightful king. The rebellion was supported by Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV and Richard III, who provided funds and troops. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who had been Richard III's designated heir before Bosworth, joined the rebellion and became its military leader. The rebels landed in Ireland, where they found support among Irish lords who had always maintained some independence from English control. They then invaded England, landing in Lancashire in June of 1487, with an army that included Irish soldiers and German mercenaries provided by Margaret of Burgundy. King Henry responded by gathering his own forces, and once again Jasper Tudor took to the field as a military commander. Though he was now 56 years old, Jasper was still capable of leading troops, and his presence with the army was both practically valuable and symbolically important. The soldiers knew that the Duke of Bedford had fought at Bosworth, had spent decades fighting for the Lancastrian cause, and was utterly loyal to King Henry. His presence reassured them and strengthened their commitment to the king. The two armies met at the Battle of Stoke Field on June 16, 1487. This was the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses, and it was a hard-fought engagement. The rebel army fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant certain death for the leaders. But Henry's forces were larger and better equipped, and they had the advantage of fighting on ground of their own choosing. The battle ended in a decisive royal victory. The Earl of Lincoln was killed in the fighting. Lambert Simnel was captured. Rather than executing him, Henry showed mercy appropriate to a boy who had been used as a pawn by adult conspirators, eventually giving him employment in the royal kitchens and later as a falconer. The rebellion was crushed, and Henry's position on the throne was significantly strengthened. Jasper's role at Stoke Field was important. He commanded a division of the royal army and helped ensure that the battle was fought according to Henry's plan. His experience and steady leadership contributed to the victory, and his presence at this battle meant that Jasper had fought in the first major battle of the Wars of the Roses at St. Albans in 1455, and in the last major battle at Stoke Field in 1487. A remarkable 32-year span of involvement in the conflict that had torn England apart. After Stoke Field, the threat of serious military challenge to Henry's rule diminished significantly. There would be other conspiracies and pretenders, most notably Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower, and whose rebellion dragged on for several years in the early 1490s. But none of these later challenges came as close to overthrowing Henry as the Lambert-Simnel rebellion had. With military threats reduced, Jasper was able to focus more on his administrative and governmental responsibilities. He continued to serve on the Royal Council, advising Henry on policy matters. He oversaw the governance of Wales and the Welsh marches, working to maintain order and enforce royal authority in regions that had historically been difficult to control from London. Jasper also served in various ceremonial and diplomatic roles that demonstrated his high status and the king's confidence in him. He was appointed Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth when she was pregnant, responsible for ensuring proper arrangements for the Queen's care and for the royal birth. When Prince Arthur, Henry and Elizabeth's first child and heir to the throne, was born in September of 1486, Jasper was among those given important ceremonial roles in the christening and other celebrations. In 1488, Jasper was appointed to treat with King James III of Scotland regarding a potential peace treaty between England and Scotland. This was a position of considerable diplomatic importance. Relations between England and Scotland had been hostile for generations, with frequent border warfare and Scottish support for English rebels. A genuine peace treaty would be a significant achievement for Henry's government. Though the mission did not result in an immediate comprehensive treaty, it was part of the longer diplomatic process that would eventually lead to better relations between the two kingdoms. Throughout these years, Jasper maintained his connection to Wales and to Pembroke Castle in particular. He visited his Welsh estates regularly, showing himself to his tenants and officials, maintaining the personal presence that medieval governance required. He patronized Welsh poets and bards who celebrated the Tudor family's Welsh heritage and praised Jasper's loyalty and accomplishments. He was remembered in Welsh tradition as Il Penfro, the Earl of Pembroke, even after his elevation to Duke of Bedford, showing that his Welsh identity remained central to how he was perceived. Jasper also seems to have maintained contact with his nephew Henry Tudor, the young man he had protected and mentored through 14 years of exile. Though Henry was now king and Jasper a subject, the bond between them remained strong. Henry continued to rely on his uncle's advice and to honor him with important positions. The relationship between king and uncle seems to have been genuinely affectionate, as well as politically important. They had been through too much together for their connection to be merely formal. As Jasper moved through his late 50s and into his early 60s, he must have reflected often on the extraordinary arc of his life. He had been born a secret prince, the illegitimate son of a queen and a Welsh gentleman. He had been acknowledged by a king and raised to the peerage. He had seen the Lancastrian dynasty destroyed and had spent decades fighting hopeless battles to restore it. He had endured exile, poverty, and repeated defeat. And then, in the last decade of his life, he had seen complete vindication of his loyalty, his nephew on the throne, his family name secure, his own position one of the highest in the realm. But with age came inevitable decline in health and vigour. By 1495, Jasper was 64 years old, quite elderly by the standards of the time when life expectancy was much lower than it is today. The years of hardship, sleeping rough during military campaigns, enduring poverty during exile, surviving on inadequate food and in harsh conditions, had taken their toll on his body, even if his spirit remained strong. In December of 1495, Jasper was at Thornbury Castle in Gloucestershire, one of the properties that had come to him through his marriage to Catherine Woodville. He had been ill for some time, probably suffering from one of the many diseases that medieval medicine could not effectively treat. His condition worsened, and it became clear that his death was approaching. On December 21st, 1495, Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, died at Thornbury Castle at the age of 64. His wife Catherine was with him at the end, as were chaplains who provided the religious comfort and last rites that were so important to medieval people facing death. Jasper died in his bed, surrounded by the comfort and security that had been so long denied to him during the middle years of his life, mourned by a family he had helped to establish on the throne of England. King Henry VII was deeply affected by his uncle's death. He had lost the man who had been more than an uncle, a mentor, a protector, a constant companion through years of exile, the person who had never given up on him even when giving up would have been the rational choice. Henry ordered that Jasper be given a funeral befitting his rank and his service to the crown, and he personally attended to ensure that his uncle was honoured properly. Jasper's body was taken to Keynsham Abbey in Somerset for burial. Keynsham Abbey was a house of Augustinian canons, a religious order known for their learning and their service to the community. It was a fitting resting place for a man who had always maintained his Catholic faith, and who had, despite all his military activities, remained sincerely religious throughout his life. The funeral at Keynsham Abbey was a magnificent affair attended by King Henry himself, by Queen Elizabeth, by numerous nobles and church leaders, and by many others who had known Jasper or who wanted to pay their respects to one of the last survivors of the old generation that had fought through the Wars of the Roses. The funeral service would have included requiem masses, prayers for Jasper's soul, and all the solemn ceremony that the late medieval church used to mark the passing of great men. Jasper was buried in the choir of the Abbey Church, a position of honour reserved for the Abbey's greatest benefactors and most distinguished patrons. A tomb was erected over his grave, though sadly this tomb does not survive. Keynsham Abbey was dissolved during King Henry VIII's suppression of the monasteries in the 1530s, and the buildings were eventually demolished and the materials sold off or reused. Jasper's tomb was destroyed along with the abbey, and the exact location of his remains is no longer known. But while Jasper's physical tomb may be lost, his legacy lived on in profound ways. Most obviously, his nephew, whom he had protected and mentored, became the founder of one of England's most famous royal dynasties. Henry VII reigned until 1509, establishing stable government, filling the royal treasury, and laying the foundations for England's later power and prosperity. Henry's son, Henry VIII, became one of England's most famous kings, known for his 6 marriages, his break with Rome, and his establishment of the Church of England. Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, reigned for 45 years and presided over a golden age of English culture, exploration, and power. All of these Tudor monarchs owed their positions to the fact that Jasper Tudor had never given up, had protected young Henry through years of exile, and had helped him win the throne at Bosworth Field. Without Jasper's loyalty and determination, Without his willingness to endure decades of hardship and defeat, the Tudor dynasty would never have existed, and English history would have taken a completely different course. Jasper's personal qualities, his loyalty, his determination, his courage in the face of repeated defeat, were remembered and celebrated. He became a symbol of faithful service, of devotion to a cause beyond personal interest, of the kind of steadfast character that medieval society valued highly. Welsh poets and bards celebrated him as a great Welsh nobleman who had honoured his heritage while achieving success in the wider English world. In his own lifetime, Jasper had styled himself with titles that captured his extraordinary life and achievements. The High and Mighty Prince Jasper, brother and uncle of kings, Duke of Bedford and Earl of Pembroke. This styling emphasized both his relationship to royalty, brother to Henry VI, uncle to Henry VII, and his own high rank achieved through those relationships and through his own service. But perhaps Jasper's greatest legacy was simply the example he provided of how to live with purpose and integrity through extraordinary challenges. He had every reason to give up at multiple points in his life: after Mortimer's cross and his father's execution, after the destruction of the Lancastrian cause in 1471, during the long years of poverty-stricken exile in Brittany. Many men would have accepted defeat, would have made peace with the Yorkist regime, would have abandoned a cause that seemed utterly lost. But Jasper never wavered. He had sworn an oath of loyalty to his half-brother King Henry VI and to the House of Lancaster, and he honoured that oath, no matter what it cost him personally. When King Henry and the direct Lancastrian line died, Jasper transferred that loyalty to his nephew Henry Tudor, seeing in the young man the last hope of Lancastrian survival. And through sheer determination, through refusing to accept defeat, through patient mentoring of his nephew through years when there seemed no prospect of success, Jasper ultimately achieved a victory that must have seemed impossible during the dark years of exile. This is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Jasper's story. Not the battles he fought or the titles he gained, but the simple fact that he never stopped believing in his cause and never stopped working toward its ultimate success. In a cynical age that often values pragmatism over principle and success over loyalty, Jasper Tudor's life stands as a reminder that there is value in maintaining one's commitments even when doing so seems pointless, that loyalty and determination can sometimes achieve what cleverness and betrayal cannot. The Tudor dynasty that Jasper helped to establish would rule England and Wales for 118 years, from Henry VII's victory at Bosworth in 1485 until the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. During that time, England would transform from a relatively minor European kingdom exhausted by civil war into one of the world's great powers, with a global empire beginning to take shape, with religious and cultural achievements that still resonate today, and with a sense of national identity and purpose that would shape British history for centuries to come. And at the root of all this achievement, at the very beginning of the Tudor dynasty, stands Jasper Tudor, the secret prince who became an earl, the loyal brother who fought for 3 decades to defend his king, the guardian uncle who protected and mentored the boy who would become Henry VII, the exile who never gave up hope, and finally the duke who lived just long enough to see his nephew secure on the throne and the Tudor dynasty established. When listeners drift off to sleep to the story of Jasper Tudor's remarkable life, they can rest knowing that his was a story of loyalty rewarded, of determination vindicated, of how one person's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds can change the course of history. From his birth in November of 1431 to his death in December of 1495, Jasper Tudor lived through extraordinary times and helped shape them according to his principles and his unwavering commitment to the people and causes he loved. May his memory be honoured, and may his example of loyalty and determination continue to inspire those who hear his story, whether they drift into peaceful dreams or remain awake to contemplate the remarkable journey of a man who truly earned his rest when death finally came to him at Thornbury Castle on that winter day in 1495.